Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Anastasia,
I'm Shiloh.
and this is the place where we search for the theories that are going to change the world. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about on this podcast is quantum mechanics. Specifically, we're a little bit perplexed by the fact that this deeply paradoxical, deeply mathematical way of seeing the world that doesn't really map onto conventional reality has become the absolute default way in which we interpret the world. And for the last few years, we've been digging through the history and trying to understand when exactly this happened. And despite the fact that we have some ideas that we've presented on the podcast for when we think this happened, we're still a little bit at a loss for explaining how it happened, why it happened, what were the motivating psychological features that convinced the entire world that the best way to understand fundamental physics was through the lens of completely illegible paradox. And our friend Jim recently brought to our attention a YouTube channel called Jung to Live By, which is hosted by a guy named James P. Dowling, where there was a video about the correspondence between Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung. So, for those of you who don't know, Pauli is an instrumental figure in the formulation of quantum mechanics. He came up with the fourth quantum number, this idea that there is a specific fourth state that all atoms occupy that resolved a lot of the mathematical difficulties of quantum mechanics that actually cemented it into the formulas and formats that we use today. And so, our conversation today is about the influence of archetypes on the emergence of quantum physics. But before we can get to the substance of the relationship between archetypes and our current conception of the atom and why it is the way that it is, we first have to lay a bunch of groundwork for Jung's work because it's not something that we're particularly familiar with. And so I would say the first 2/3 of the conversation is us wrestling with what are archetypes, what are instincts, what is this analytic psychology business, how does it work and what can it tell us? And then once we lay that out, then we can move on to the question of what does applying these principles of Jungian archetypes to history tell us about the people that were formulating quantum physics, and what does it tell us about the world that we live in today, simulation hypothesis, and really the future of the species. We even touch upon a bunch of questions surrounding like Darwinian evolution and the idea that perhaps there's something in this archetypal narrative that resists mathematization, but is a really, really important feature of evolution.
And there's a bunch of saleable features that you can put into practice in your own life, which is really cool that we discovered. I don't know, I hadn't heard a lot of this stuff or thought of it that way. And there's a lot of misconceptions about archetypes and Jung's work in general, which we also uncover. So there's a lot going on in this conversation, which hopefully gives us a better handle on why we're left with a probabilistic universe today and where we go forward. It's such a wide-ranging conversation otherwise. I think you guys are going to love it. We're going to talk about the lives and deaths of institution, the possibility of repair versus revolution in the future, and everything in between. Remember, guys, this podcast is entirely paid for by you guys. We don't have any sponsors. We're not selling anything that we didn't make ourselves. If you want to see us be able to improve this project, that means doing these interviews in person. It means putting on more live events like the one that we did this last summer in Sesimbra, Portugal. It means being able to spend more time and energy devoted towards actually finding the best conversations and cultivating them for you. Then come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and see if you can give as little as 75 cents a week to the project to power it forward. The law of large numbers shows that all of these little donations make a huge difference, and you probably have 75 cents lying on your kitchen table right now that you could help power this project with, and it would mean the world to us. If for some reason you aren't interested in Patreon, you hate them or think they're an evil corporation, you could support the podcast in other ways. You could pick up a sweatshirt, which is linked down below on the YouTube shelf. We have also just finished our first album with our musical project, Secretary of Nature, and we have vinyl records available right now down on the YouTube shelf, which you can pick up. And if you have a record player, this is the best way to enjoy this music because it was made to be listened to on two sides all the way through. And we're really proud of it. I think you'll love it. So pick it up for yourself maybe you have a friend who has a record player, make a great stocking stuffer as we move towards the holiday season. Free shipping.
I would also like to take the opportunity to remind you about Paradigm Drift. It is the show where we collect theories all month and then we give random theorists the chance to present their ideas about how the world works in 60 seconds. Our next taping is going to be on October 17th at 7 p.m., and you can sign up to present at the link in the description below. I hope we see you there. It's a really good time. It's a really new thing that we're trying to build. We want to have a community of theorists that are all present, not just to present their ideas, but also to help people workshop their ideas. That's really the most important part of it. It's not just an opportunity to put your theory out in the world and then, drop the microphone and leave. It really is meant to be a place where those with ideas can gather and refine them. And so I hope to see you there. It's really fun to tape it. Shiloh does all the live music. We have a really lively chat that goes on during the entire show. And so come on by, October 17th, 7 p.m. Pacific.
Otherwise, enjoy the conversation with James about archetypes and the mathematical atom.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm working on a video at the moment on the Trickster archetype, and that's the big part of it. That only becomes active, it seems, in someone's life if they think that they're more important than somebody else, or more conscious, more refined, more rational. And then that function comes out as if to remind them, you're a stupid animal, just like everybody else. People do get their comeuppance in that way an awful lot.
Is the idea that these archetypes arise at different points in your life, is that a pretty common motif in the Jungian canon?
Yeah. There are some that are very clearly ontogenetically based. They will come on and they will develop across your life. But there are others, like the Trickster, which is a very popular one on the internet, weirdly enough. But Jung wrote about it once in 1954. That's it. From everything else, you've got to sort of infer what he's talking about. And it's not an ontogenetic one. It's almost like a regulatory one. Jung described it as being as if a remnant of an earlier kind of consciousness, very ancient, very animal, primordial. And we've sort of morphed it into traditions and cultures across time, but it's never gone away. And it comes out, and it will cause you to have faux pas, slips of the tongue, and to do stupid little status things like you've mentioned, in a deliberate attempt to get you to not so much humble yourself, but to realize you're not the big shot that you really think that you are. And that's the Bugs Bunny stuff and all the trickster myths throughout history. That's what you always see.
You used a word I've never heard before, ontogenetic. What does that mean?
So across, as if the development of your life. So I suppose we could start it from the moment of conception if we want to, but building across through to puberty being the main one, what Jung would have called the archetypes. They will change, they will mature, they will develop. Sometimes it seems that they don't get the proper expression that they need. And then clinical symptoms, or just the type of day-to-day neurosis that people have, results from that. The person who pushed this forward the most, who's so important in Jungian psychology, and nowhere near enough people talk about him, Dr. Anthony Stevens, passed away a couple of years ago. He was the first guy to take Jung, mix him in with biology in a really rigorous case, without losing the poetry of it, but losing all of the mystical fluff that people insist on tacking onto Jung.
So is there like a standard pattern of expression then? Obviously human beings, I'm trying to make this genetic analogy more salient, but in human beings, there's a standard floor plan, like you develop arms and legs, and after you're born, maybe your body fills out, your muscles develop. There's some standard platform of genetic programs that unfold, and there are variations and so forth. Is there something like that in the Jungian conception of things as well, where there's a standard sequence of archetypes that people progress through, or is it more varied than that?
Yeah, it depends, and it's so difficult for people to get into Jung for the first time because everyone will Google the word archetype, and there's 4 million different things that will come up. You are a shadow animus priest. There is a goblin in the unconscious, which is not what he meant. The real classic one, to your point, would be something like the mother archetype. Not that it's a literal mother sitting somewhere, but it's the best word that we kind of have for it, because cross-culturally, mythologically, anthropology, etc., there's a certain aspect or experience of being a human that involves your mother. So there's an inbuilt anticipation for it. And when the archetype sees that situation in the outside world, like a mother being very kind to you, or if it's in the animal kingdom, a mother offering food, that kicks off an instinct, which then we might call attachment behavior. So when Jung first talked about archetypes, he would link them to instincts fully. But as time has gone on, and on the internet, you don't normally see that connection being made. But he insisted the whole way through, archetypes and instincts go hand in hand. You can't really separate the two of them.
I feel like instincts get a really rough treatment in rational circles. I'm not going to restrict this to science per se, but it seems like instincts, you can't trust your instincts. Instincts aren't really something that we should really try to pay attention to, maybe in the rational world. But at the same time, everybody knows that they do trust their instincts and that there are really interesting intuitions that play out and are predictive and useful. What does Jung have to say about this? Is it more that we have to cultivate that sense? We were, before the podcast started, we were watching your video, or listening, actually, as we were talking about earlier. We were listening to your video on Pauli and Jung, and this idea that Pauli was tapping into his intuitions about the atom and how antithetical that was to the standard project, especially the mathematical project of we have these axioms and this rigor and logic. But at the same time, Pauli's coming up with revelations about the atom that are ultimately instrumental in a very profound way. And I think that's something that everybody kind of identifies with. We have these intuitions, we have these revelations. They don't seem to necessarily stem from some direct application of logic and reason. And I guess the question is, how would Jung have us understand those or organize them or learn how to place more faith in one versus the other? Like, what is the method by which one can harness those kinds of intuitions without just having your brains fall out of your head, essentially?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, when we talked just before the podcast a few days ago, you guys were mentioning about the history of science and that something perhaps changed maybe around the time of Max Planck, that sort of very early period of quantum mechanics. There is something that seems to have changed over, I'm using this word metaphorically, like Western consciousness. And Jung would point to the scientific revolution for being when that shifted. We moved from a more, it's not as if people weren't rational back then. Of course they were, but it was as if there was something extra to them, and they would interpret things additionally in a spiritual way, like Johannes Kepler, very brilliant empirical scientist, entrenched in religion. And the religion didn't seem to really influence negatively the scientific work that he was doing. I like the example of Hamlet with this. Hamlet, we don't really know when that was written or published, but circa-ish the year 1600. That's smack bang around the time of the very beginnings of the scientific revolution. There was never a character like Hamlet in Western literature before. And he's the ultimate example of someone who is completely and utterly disconnected from his instincts. He's cognitively utterly brilliant. He will spiral into the most beautiful soliloquies that have ever been penned by a man. You can fall in love with his mind, and people have done so for 400 years. But at the end of the play, it's not the cognitive brilliance that wins the day. It's Fortinbras, the guy who has no personality at all, who's always just outside of the main plot, who just storms in and takes everything. He's like pure instinct. It's not saying that we should side with one or the other, but that disconnect, I think, highlights what Jung warned against quite a lot. He warned against it in terms of the progression of politics across the 20th century. And it was at the root, really, of what he thought mental illness, especially the more day-to-day stuff like neurosis, was. We had forgotten, again, using that word metaphorically, we'd forgotten what a connection to the unconscious feels like, where people used to represent that in a form of divinity. We didn't need to, or maybe it's impossible for a lot of us now to do that and to go back and do that. But that symbolic world is alive and real unto itself. And while we remain unplugged from that, we are just de facto rational people. That means that we can be manipulated on the basis of things within our unconscious mind, such as instinct. We can be controlled. And again, this is Jung's take, and this is debatable, but I side with it. A lot of the neuroses that people come across, anxieties, depressions, OCDs, they're fueled by something, as if something that's coming out in a more symbolic, unproductive form that's trying to send you a message. But because we're so rational, we never really think to turn around and listen to it. Instead, we slap labels on things. And sometimes that's brilliant. Sometimes, because it stops people going right off a cliff. But most of the time, we're sort of just lost and bombarded by things as if there's an entire other world. That doesn't answer your question. That's because your question hasn't really been answered ever. What are we all supposed to do about this kind of thing? Jung's approach was individual. We can individually do it, but it's hard and it's quite a long process. That leaves a lot of open questions, I feel.
It seems to me, at least in the context of this prediction, almost this predictive allegory that's put forth by the author of Shakespeare, it almost seems like it's a reaction or a prediction to how the world is going to suffer under this new Enlightenment paradigm. And I guess projecting forward into modernity and post-modernity and the ills that will be suffered. In other words, it seems like these pathologies result in some sense by a failure to adapt to the changing environment that as human beings we find ourselves in. Whereas the typical programs that we're operating under for million years, let's say however long we've been anatomically modern humans, but then before that as well too, like we've been adapted to a very different set of circumstances and environments. And
I just want to point out that technically, anatomically modern humans up until like a week ago were 200,000 years old, but then they found this crazy skull in China that's 1 million years old.
That's what I was referencing, yeah. That's a good find. Yeah, so I mean, I see this play out all the time where we'd want to think of ourselves as perfectly rational beings, but it's also kind of insane to do that because, of course, we're animals and we have this whole emotional landscape. You can call it culture or spirituality or whatever you want. But perhaps pre-Enlightenment, people were more oriented towards that being a reality that needed to be encoded and dealt with. Maybe institutionally, but at least on a shared structure, like some cultural attendance to this feature of reality. But it kind of got pushed down as, of course, the rationality and the Enlightenment unfolded. So I'm wondering if in some sense this entire project isn't aimed at trying to catch up to the rapid pace of progress that is completely unprecedented. And if the Jungian project is in some sense trying to bring our former self that we had evolved for, thousands and thousands of years to be one way, but now we find ourselves facing a totally different world, and we're trying to get in tune with that.
Yeah, totally agreed. I think that's really, really well put. In Jung's own words, he thought that the Enlightenment was, quote, a disaster, which is maybe a little bit strong. It's not as if he hated the Enlightenment per se, because it's kind of inevitable. Once we go down that, once we focus our cultural capital on an ever-increasing sense of science and rationality, it's going to happen that way. But the Enlightenment didn't lead to us all being enlightened beings. It led to science and technology, but also people being really weird politically, really weird. The French Revolution is one that gives me chills whenever I think about it, because that's a horrendous period of time. So yeah, the more that the conscious
Can you say more about that really quick? I mean, most people think of the French Revolution as like like getting rid of the man and taking back the power and, setting up this democratic republic and everything. Why is it a nightmare?
Well, apart from the guillotines.
Oh, the guillotines. Yeah, I forgot about those.
I think it's most horrifying is the idea that Robespierre, the arbitrary leader of the revolution, or I guess the figurehead, is the one who falls to the guillotine at the end.
Yeah.
Right? It's the idea that you open up this vast maelstrom and then it consumes you in the end, and everybody from the outside is like, well, look at that. They managed to change the world, and yet it's soaked in so much blood.
Yep. It's this perfect case study. We're all so rational and, love of our fellow man and everything else. Lovely, idealistic. But when we ignore the unconscious, because previously religious traditions would have regulated that. For better or worse, it would have at least attempted to control for that kind of unparalleled bloodshed. And then immediately after that, you get Napoleon stepping out, either by accident, luck, or he really knew what he was doing from his very deep reading of history, and people flock to him. He gets elevated to almost like a deity type figure. And you almost see as if the Iliad itself almost begins to unfold across Europe. It's a perfect case study that when we ignore instinct, instinct hits back. That was Jung's warning. So it's not that he hated technology and science and progress. It was that at the expense of those other things that we have progressively lost more and more and more of since roughly around 400 years, he would say. Or you could stretch it back. Protestant Reformation, when Catholicism is obviously saturated with symbol and ritual, and I think a lot of people, if they aren't raised Catholic, they might look at Catholicism and go, how can you believe a lot of those things? They're all very, very, very weird and strange. And Protestantism, by contrast, you can have a direct relationship with God. It's more rational. But Jung thought that was a big mistake as well. We dropped the symbolic aspect of things that used to contain forces from the unconscious in a group regulatory level. And where we are now, it doesn't look particularly good on the world stage at all. And that's why I think Jung is becoming more relevant than ever. I mean,
it's interesting.
people are... Sorry, please.
Well, it's interesting because it feels like the time that we live through right now feels more instinctive rather than rational. From the outside, I look at the way that people are being captivated by various messages, the way that there's this stream of information that is just inundating everybody, depending on what it is that they believe. The algorithm, I think, seems to be a manifestation of subconscious desire, because you hear people all the time saying that, oh, the algorithm is so toxic, it shows you all these terrible things, but they're actually telling on themselves because the algorithm feeds you the things that you look at. And so the more time that you spend engaging, even because you're looking at your cell phone, the camera for a lot of these websites is looking at where your eyes go, and so it knows that you're looking at something on a website for longer in one place than the other. And so it feels very instinctive, because you may say to yourself, oh, I'm interested in rational, calm, centrist perspectives, but then you spend most of your time engaging with something horrific on the internet, and that seems to be the manifestation of the instinctive that's coming out through the algorithm, rather than some real rational choice.
Agreed, 100%. 100%. It's the things that we fool ourselves with. But of course, a lot of it's instinctive. But the media companies and some people on YouTube, they've learned how to turn that instinctive potential into money. And so it will then continue and continue. And, it's fair enough. But then on the rational side too, because with your guys' strong biology background, this is something that's always annoyed me. I don't know about you. When people blame dopamine, they point to dopamine as if it's some kind of evil thing we shouldn't really have in our head. We should detox from it, and then we'll all be rational. They don't stop to think, well, forget the dopaminergic circuits. Let's go further back into those subcortical regions. What is it that's sort of firing? That's where we're going to find instinct.
Well, dopamine is a pretty crazy thing. So it's like you probably have heard the reports of people with Parkinson's who were treated with the early dopaminergic drugs, who would then develop gambling addiction, sex addiction. They would engage in all these risky behaviors. And so it does seem that when you stimulate that circuit excessively, you are creating some kind of insane manifestation of some deep-seated desires that otherwise are screened.
It's also kind of a master switch in the brain in some sense, like the fact that it solves motor neural problems at the same time.
Yeah, that's pretty
right?
crazy.
I mean, it works on a lot of different systems. It's kind of like serotonin too. It's like it regulates your guts, it regulates adrenaline, it regulates all sorts of things all over the place. It's not just this mood molecule, even though it might function in that way. I think they're talking about dopamine in this really refined context. I think it's the prefrontal striatum or something like that, if I recall correctly. It's like one little piece of the brain where the reward circuit is set up that does use dopamine, but a lot of other processes, especially neuromuscular stuff, uses dopamine too. So it's, I don't know.
Okay, well, so I think that we can zoom this out a little bit and basically say that there appears to be a frame that Jung is really useful for, because the idea is that in some kind of ancestral context, there was a lot of ritual and symbolism, and there were features of the human psyche, the interior world of a human, that were laid out in some kind of symbolic way that allowed us to process the things that were happening to us in, I don't want to say a divine way, but in a way that allowed us to map the meaning of these events. And as we went through the Enlightenment and we became progressively more rational, and symbolism was stripped gradually from the world until the point where we live in these very modern environments where everything is quite literal and nothing has this patina of meaning to it, we are now vulnerable to some kind of external influence, because someone somewhere still understands the importance of this instinct, of this psyche, of these archetypes. And by virtue of their understanding, you said something really interesting, is that they were able to take instinct and transform it into money. And so now we live in a society that, because we have abandoned our own hold on these archetypes, somebody else is holding them and somebody else is playing us like puppets. Is that kind of the frame that you use?
De facto, yeah. There's a Darwinian underlay quite clearly to everything that us as humans do. There are some evolutionary biologists who really talk about this a lot, and I really respect them for it, because it's not a very popular political thing to say. But a lot of them, unfortunately, it's almost as if Darwin applies to everything except for human beings. We've almost by default transcended that with our logic and rationality, which doesn't make any sense at all. So if you remove that, symbolic's a broad word, but if you remove that overlay, you don't remove the libido. And the libido defaults back, it seems, to raw instinctive gratification, would be one word for it. And you see that again politically all over the place. People as if are looking for a story. They want a tribe and they want an outgroup. And kids will do this when they'll get obsessively into some kind of fandom. It's like instinct and identity get infused together for social reasons and ways of explaining yourself. But when we become adults and when things happen within the culture, there are other things besides our ego. I get teased sometimes for using that word. It's the Latin pronunciation of ego. There are other things within the unconscious that will watch through our eyes. And it's those things that are the archetypes, and their job is to kick off instinct. So yeah, if we're not in touch with that, and Jung laid out lots of ways in which we individually can do that, we do become vulnerable to just being run by instinct. And that's to your point when you said that we are living in a very instinctive time. Yeah, we are. We really are. But people don't tend to recognize it in that kind of way.
And the problem with not recognizing it is that it kind of operates without your knowing, and you can be led down some really strange paths. Like I had this really interesting discussion with my students on the first day of class about how it was that scientists were motivated in the world. Because, we go through this thing, we're like, what's the difference between science and technology? Obviously, technology and engineers are motivated because if they develop a banger product, they're going to get rich, and maybe they'll be the next Elon Musk or something like that. But then I say, like, why are scientists motivated to do what they do? And like, few kids are like, oh, they're just curious and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's really cute. Like, I hope that's true. Like, you're an angel. That's great. I hope they are. And honestly, I've met many who are motivated by curiosity and the satisfaction of deducing nature's mysteries. That does happen for sure. But what about the rest of them? Like, they're not getting paid. You basically have like a salary cap if you're a scientist. Like, you can get grants, but most of it's going to the university. The rest of it's going to your equipment, students, staff. Like, you're going to make like a middle-class salary at best, even if you're an amazing scientist. So what are you motivated by? And one kid in the front row was like, glory. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Achilles. Exactly. Yeah. And so, of course, what happens when you chase glory? Like, well, all sorts of bad things can happen, first of all, but in the face of trying to make rational deductions about the world, you might find yourself really seduced by some vision of how things should work, to the point that, and if you're really, really smart, if you're a genius, if you're some super high echelon egghead, you probably can convince other people that your view of the world is the correct view of the world. But are you still driven by that curiosity that you had as a kid, or are you now possessed by needing to get paid for your work? And you're not going to get paid in money. So what are you going to get paid in? You're going to get paid in social status. You're going to get paid in prizes. You're going to get paid in glory, essentially, right? And so, this course I'm teaching, and like the whole thing downstream is like, wait a second, like a lot of the ideas we have, this first semester is about the solar system. It's like a lot of the stories we have are somewhat arbitrary, and they were decided essentially by really famous people who were glorified at the time, and everybody just kind of took it on face and moved on. And so there's all these little Swiss cheese holes in the plot that get paved over. And I think a lot of that derives back to ignoring the fact that these are human beings that are very complex animals who have motivational structures that aren't accounted for in this idealized form of objective analysis of nature, which is, that's a beautiful idea, but the reality is that we're still animals doing this project. And without any kind of institutionalized structure to examine that, whether it's symbolic art that's widespread, the university I work in, it's a giant brick building. It's like very brutalist looking, like the word science is printed on the front of the building, and that's it. Like, there's no sculpture, symbology, there's no reverence for what we're doing. It's literally just this industrial project of like, what? What? If it's not technologically oriented, what the hell is science doing? And there's no real place for that. So I worry about that in terms of, and I think the world is reacting in a really, really insane way to the sanitization of all of these industries. Like, it's clearly not, it doesn't feel right to most people. And there's a lot of steam building up in the kettle as a result of it, I feel like.
And so I wonder maybe if we can make a Jungian analysis of that situation. Because I think that you're exactly right, that we live in a society that's deeply driven by this scientific, technological, engineering mindset. And if, James, you are correct in the application of Jungian ideas to it, it means that there must be something that we can see in the way that all of these narratives play out that reveals some deeper features of the world.
So that's a big question. That's a very big question. I remember what it was like actually to be an undergraduate in biochemistry, and then in my master's in cell biology, and then the year and a half-ish, I did PhD in biochemistry. And I always felt a little bit different to my peers, but they all probably felt different to each other. And that's the thing, where we are, at the end of the day, all individuals. So I loved the example that you gave, that the glory. And it's like, it'd be so easy to go down a psychoanalytic route and to say, well, if that person had just balanced the things within their childhood, maybe they wouldn't be interested in glory. Actually, we can hypothesize, there's kind of a normal distribution ish among different traits in human beings. Maybe some people are just going to be driven by glory. Fair enough. I think that's fair. But we do see other things as well. One is it's a weird thing with science that's different to psychology. In psychology, we have schools and lineages. You can kind of look back in time, and there's your lineage, your school. In science, we kind of don't really have that. We've got the great figures of science, Darwin and Einstein and everybody else, but I don't think individual scientists feel like they're connected to that. I don't think they feel that they're sharing a mission passed down a lineage. They're almost deified, I feel, and myths crop up about them. And I wonder how much of what you guys are talking about is because individual scientists, whether they're in their bachelor's, master's, PhD, whatever, how much of that is they've just fallen into a subject that they really enjoy, but because of the way that society and school, etc., is set up, they've never stopped to think and reflect and consider the deeper meaning of the path and the tradition that they've chosen to step into. I have a feeling a lot of it is that, because once we start moving towards big collective projects, I think of things like Silicon Valley and the people who think that they can speak for all of us and try and save the world in one way or another, by default then we are not being individuals, and we risk at that point what Jung termed inflation, where an archetype broadly will come in, expand the conscious mind, and basically possess the conscious mind. The person no longer makes a distinction between themselves and something that's really not them at all. It's shared between them and the rest of humanity. You see that in war or political figures, and I do think you see that with some people who think that they're kind of prophets of a new world today. That's a quick answer to what you asked, but I think if we're going to attempt to chip into it, we have to look at the individual journey and the personal myth of the person versus what they've kind of been grooved and boxed into, because otherwise they'll never even ask the question in the first place.
Yeah. Is there some standard Jungian frame that's used for that?
No.
That's a really
Yes
difficult
and no.
question.
Yes and no. A lot, I don't want to group everyone in with this, but the Jungian tradition is a little bit odd. So you had Jung, who did his thing, and then you had kind of these people working around the same time as him who canonized him. They took his ideas, very unsystematic, and put them out in ways that other people could understand. Very useful. Since that period of time, there's not really been a successor or a canonical lineage from Jung. So the frames that people will take are often very different. And the frames I see a lot of people take immediately go to archetypes as a pure explanation. But archetypes in a story form, in a myth form, in a fairy tale form, rather than the nitty gritty of sort of the real everyday life. I mentioned Anthony Stevens earlier. I like him an awful lot because he dropped a lot of the fluff, put it into animal behavior and animal psychology, then moved it into the clinical direction. So if we're going to take a Jungian frame, he'd be the person to look at. But he's not the norm in normal Jungian psychology. As I say, a lot of it drifts into non-applicable fluff, unfortunately.
What does Stevens do that is unique, that draws you to his analysis?
He was unafraid to move into biology. And biology and Jung tend not really to go hand in hand with each other, which is something that Jung didn't like himself. He was very much in favor of biology. He didn't like it when people misrepresented his ideas to say, for example, that archetypes are floating stories within the unconscious. He didn't believe that at all. He linked them to instinct. So Anthony Stevens, starting in the 1960s, started doing that. And what he saw out of the ethology tradition, the study of animal behavior, he saw what Konrad Lorenz was doing, Nico Tinbergen was doing, the other guys were doing, and saying, hang on, you're studying the same thing as Jung at base. Now, Jung took the archetype further, but the core definition, an inbuilt form that structures our perception and apperception that kicks off an instinct, the ethologists have found that too. The innate releasing mechanism in the psyche that responds to a sign stimulus. an archetypal scenario in the outside world. So he rescued Jung from disappearing off into fluff, basically, because he's so easy to turn into fluff because he was so unsystematic. You can turn Jung into whatever you want. You can either love him or you can hate him, but he's just there. So Stevens is the great translator of Jung, as far as I'm concerned, and he grounded him properly in evolutionary biology. And as a biologist, like, yes, absolutely, that's the way to go.
And so how do you begin? So you imagine that there's a person that is attempting to understand something about their life through the lens of Jung. But like, as you say, this is a somewhat esoteric, not particularly linear presentation. Like from reading about Jung, it seems like he was writing and then going and talking to his associates and his peers, and there was a lot of direct contact with Jung that was necessary in order to be able to understand what it was that he was talking about. And so we obviously can't sit down with Jung. And so since you've been studying this so deeply, like, what is the frame that you have gradually come to use for analyzing situations? Is there something linear that you have managed to pull out of it, or is it still very piecemeal and dependent on the situation?
This is partly, I suppose, a style preference, but partly based on Anthony Stevens. If Darwin ever leaves the picture, I feel very uncomfortable on the inside, because I feel like we've lost the grounding. And if we lose that biology, if we lose instinct, then, well, everything's an archetype. Oh, look, they're acting out this particular pattern or this particular motif. Yeah, but why? And if we are evolved organisms, these archetypes are shaped by evolution, which means they must fundamentally serve adaptation. So that's the typical frame that I personally would take with that. It doesn't mean that others are necessarily wrong, and sometimes moving in that mythological direction can give you a very different frame of things. But if we really think about it, if people are being hurt, real lives influenced to the negative, again, I'm thinking politically, things on the world stage, it's a bit silly to drift off into mythic fluff. Wouldn't it be better to understand what darker parts of biology are working through people that lead them to power, control, hurting, domination, the things that we don't like and we shove into the collective shadow, basically. I'm not sure if that answers you, though, to be fair.
I guess I'm trying to find a handle on this, because it's, to me, still somewhat difficult to wrap my head around, in the sense that, yes, there are archetypes, and it appears to be I don't totally understand yet what is the role of the archetypes and how do they manifest, and what is the proper way of engaging with that? Like, Shiloh asked earlier if there was some developmental path that everybody's supposed to go through in order to end at the place where they're fully individuated in possession of this integrated picture of themselves. And so I guess I was wondering if you had some framework for understanding the interplay between the human, the individual development, and then this much larger evolutionary frame that spans generations.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yes, it's a concept that doesn't typically get talked about that much in Jungian psychology, which is a huge shame. Complexes are that link. A complex, when people hear the word complex, they'll think daddy issues or something, right? There's some kind of childhood trauma there. A complex is an archetype actualized in the mind. So we've moved from, presumably within the genome, the human species, a potential, and all the archetypes would be there, all the nice ones and all the ones that we don't like to look at. And that's where people often get mythological and romantic about the shadow when they don't need to, But certain archetypes will become active in an individual person's mind. That's called a complex. It will then wrap itself in your memories, linked together via association, and be an active part of your psychology, as if a part of your everyday operating system. And proving their existence is really easy. Really easy. It's what Jung and his colleague Franz Ricklin did. They were the first people to do this in a research sense, in the way that we'd recognize that term today, in 1904. They took a bunch of their, they called it in lovely terms, the associations of normal subjects. Complexes and weird bits of the mind had been studied for a long time beforehand, but never really in normal, healthy people. So Jung and Ricklin dragged their friends in and people off the street, sat them down and did the word association test, the stuff that's turned into a meme now. And the properties that they got from that showed that, and I'm very happy to go further into this, but the long and short of it, people have different modes, and you can trigger those modes quite easily. And those different modes will interfere with each other. It's as if, not quite that we've got different subunits of personality, but it's as if there's different parts of us that are online at different times. Each of those has an archetype at its core, and hence heavily linked to instinct. So when Jung spoke about individuation, the large bulk of that is coming to terms with understanding and integrating those other parts of ourselves. People will jump to the archetype for that, but it's not. That's just a potential. That's a form. The complex is where it goes from universal human species, 2 million or however many years old, through to you in your life. How's that appearing for you? That's the linking bridge. So an analysis of complexes in your own life or culturally, that would be the linking bridge. Does that answer your question, though?
It's starting to. So what is what is this word association test?
So you would sit down with an unlucky volunteer or someone that you've just dragged in, and you'd have a list of preset words, and you'd run down them exactly as you see in Netflix TV series and whatever. It's very, very similar to that. Dog. What did the person say back? Or black. What did the person say back? And you note down the reaction time as you go through that. And you go through the full list. Then you do the list again. And you notice, first time around, you replied with that word. And now you've given a completely different word. So Jung and Ricklin did this again and again and again and again with tons and tons of people. And they used proto-statistics, basically, to map out the different traits that these things have. And very peculiar things will come up. Sometimes someone will respond as if very suspiciously, as if they're, like if you say black and they say white, comes across like, are you sure? That's your immediate association to that word. Or you might say black and the person pauses for a minute before replying. So why are you taking a minute to reply to that? That's really, really strange. And they had no idea what it was before they started doing this. But they noticed that, and with the key point here being emotion or affect, it's as if certain words will hit on that emotional or affective part of being a person. And that emotion or affect will then interfere with what would otherwise presumably be a very rational exercise in going through and responding with certain reaction words back. From that, they realized that there seems to be a link between affect and emotion, and quite clearly, association. Associations, memories, as if wrapped around this affective nucleus. And they published their findings, no archetypes mentioned. Jung hadn't even thought of the word archetype yet, as clinical results. That here we have something called a feeling-toned complex that you can trigger off, that will be triggered off based on certain things. I mean, we have it today when people say in universities, like, I need a safe space. And it's like, yeah, and people like to make fun of that. Fair enough. But they're going to be triggered by something. That's the word that they use. And it's like, well, why? Because there's something within them, something emotional, that's wrapped itself around certain memories and associations. It's exactly what Jung was talking about. Later on down the line, and this took decades, he realized that complexes were not infinitely varied. So they're not just someone yelled at you when you were 4, and so therefore you've got this little split off thing that reacts in a bad way, or you're in a car crash or something, classical trauma or PTSD or CPTSD. Instead, they seem to share only a very limited number of categories relating to one's mother, relating to one's father, relating to superiority or inferiority, status stuff, or anxiety. There are a set limited number. So he put forward that, well, what if there's something collective and universal, a disposition that we have, and it's certain triggers within the environment will kick that off, bring it forward into the conscious mind, and now you're stuck with it. Now it's part of your personality, whether it's there to protect you or otherwise, doesn't matter at this stage. It's a collective universal thing, but it's also at the same time personal to you. As if it's got two sides or two faces to it. So word association test was his, and he repeated this again and again and again across his career, and he hammered it home probably way too much. It was his original empirical evidence for not just complexes, but also archetypes.
And so the idea is that there is almost an infinite number of things that can happen to you, but there's something in the mind that filters that immense collection of events down into some set number of categories that manifest as it's like personality characteristics. Is that what an archetype is?
Basically, yeah. There's different levels to it, and we can distract and look at what people tend to do and look at the myths and the stories, the dreams. Isn't this wonderful? But yeah, in everyone's day-to-day life, what are their complexes? What are the weird and wonderful, strange, sometimes very disturbing or annoying aspects of their psychology? And if they are based on instinct, and they seem to be, that's the affective charge. Affect is directly plugged into drive in particular, which is then plugged into instinct, drawing on affective neuroscience and neuropsychoanalysis there. Then
Is there a difference between affect and emotion?
Yes. Affect, if people use those terms day to day, they basically just mean the same thing. But an affect is the raw phenomenology experience. If it's an emotion, that's as if you've taken that experience and you've turned it into more of a story. You've labeled the experience anger or rage or fear with a weaving of meaning and a story around it. So,
but affect is like the primary physical sensation.
Yes. And we know from Jaak Panksepp's work in affective neuroscience, there seems to be at least 7 discrete affective circuits within the subcortical regions of the human brain. And you can stimulate them off and people will experience raw affect, which they often report is really quite strange. Done it in animals, done it in humans. Seeking, rage, play, which is the one that got all the news attention like 15 years ago, the full lot. And so if complexes are related to affect, if that's what you're triggering off, you're in subcortical region territory immediately. And it seems neuroscience has at least discovered 7 core affective circuits, which is very exciting.
Tyler, are you going to say something? I see you scribbling.
I got ideas, but I want to change the topic until you're satisfied.
Pardon the interruption, but I once again have to ask you for a favor. If you were listening to this podcast and you are enjoying what you hear, or you've listened to a couple episodes of the podcast and you're pretty impressed by the fact that there's a place on the internet where people can explore ideas without losing their minds, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For 75 cents a week, you can help ensure that this project survives and transitions towards being a thing that happens in person instead of just through the internet. So hopefully, I'll see you there. Okay, affect and emotion and experiences in the mind are wrapped into something that Jung called complexes, and that these complexes eventually for him became the archetypes because he realized that there was a set number of complexes that emerge from this interface between a normal biological response to some vast number of experiences. Is that accurate?
It is. In addition to his Jung cut his teeth working at the Berg Holsley, big asylum, basically. So he was doing real clinical work and also research at the same time. His archetypal hypothesis initially came out of working with schizophrenic patients at the time called dementia praecox. I'm glad they changed that term over the years. And he noticed that in their dreams and their spontaneous fantasies, really weird, mythic, that's really the best way of putting it, mythic motifs and symbols would arise, which you wouldn't really get in the average person. Again, what we've been talking about a lot so far, a lot of us like to think we're very rational and we come across that way. But when the psyche begins to break down, other things start to come through. And for some strange reason, it likes to represent itself as if in mythological motifs. So he puts this all down in a book that's unfortunately got some big problems with it. I won't champion Jung for no reason, but the first book he laid it down in 1912, which directly led to his split with Sigmund Freud. He lays a lot of this stuff out. He then goes into his Red Book phase. He basically starts to go a bit mad. He starts to have very, very weird, vivid dreams. He starts to get visions. He's not actually particularly crystal clear as to what really happened with him, but that's the rough ballpark. And it was through engaging with the same spontaneous things that he saw in his schizophrenic patients, but within himself, that he's not schizophrenic, something else is going on, that led to the development properly of his archetypal hypothesis. He then drops that in 1919, fresh after the Red Book phase, right as that's just wrapped up. So really, he came to it from those two different angles. Yeah, complexes that originally were just things that we picked up in the conscious mind. And I think a lot of people implicitly know what that is today. We overthink and we ruminate, or we get anxious, and we might hate ourselves sometimes. And why did I do that really embarrassing thing? I wish I was more confident. Stuff like that. That's complex territory. But Jung wanted to trace the roots of complexes deeper. And that's where he dovetailed it with the archetype. So in a normal working mind, in a healthy person, you'd see complexes pretty easily. But proving the existence of archetypes is something he came up with again and again and again, is something really difficult. People would say, how do you know these things are there? And he's like, well, it's hard in normal functioning people to do that. But here's the evidence that I've got. That's why he then became obsessed for like 20, 30 years with alchemy. It was like, oh my God, these guys have, they've projected the individuation process, the working with archetypes and complexes into matter itself. Isn't that brilliant? And he goes off on his weird idiosyncratic roots with that. But he has strong evidence for it. Complexes is probably the best, because that's what you can see when you study anybody, to be fair.
And so how many archetypes does he map onto the mind?
That's a question as well that's bothered a lot of people. Are there an infinite number of archetypes? Are there not? There seems to be an infinite potential of forms, but I personally would side with no. There's going to be a set number of these things. Probably a bit like genetics, where for the longest time we thought we had individual genes, but now we know it's not quite that neat and tidy. You can have genes that really are just open reading frames, and they can be transcribed this way, that way. Things overlap and become more complicated. So a plurality that then leads to whatever a person really is. I think there's a lot of research to be done on exactly that question. Apparently, that's what some of the real top tier Jungians, when they go to their conferences recently, are all currently arguing about and trying to suss out. How many are there? What do we all mean by it? Is your conception of archetype different to mine? And the answer seems to be, yeah. So they're, 100 years later, they're still trying to tie all this stuff together.
That's a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, I know.
So then, if there is, I guess it seems like you can't really, You can't really get away from the fact that you need Jung to be able to interpret this, right? So he had some kind of mind that was both analytic and mythological, and he had his own visions and created a map of what these things meant. And from how I've read his work, it seems like people come to him, he teaches them to do this spontaneous generation of imagery where they begin to have either waking dreams or they're able to pay attention to their dreams, and then they come to him after writing out their stories and he helps them understand what's playing out, but he's basically doing the interpretation himself off this huge depth of knowledge that he has. And so from what you're saying, it sounds like it's not something that is a concrete technique that you can teach somebody, or really even something that has real firm handles on it. It's more instinctive.
It is. I'm so happy that you've raised that, because you mentioned the trickster as well earlier. If somebody copies Jung, so I'll just do what he did. I'll analyze my dreams, I'll do active imagination, and I will ask the unconscious to make me healthy, cool, and strong. That seems to be when the trickster is then constellated, to give them a little smack, because we can't do that. We're all individual people, and we can't. There's no grooved route for pulling health and potential out of the unconscious. We have to live it ourselves. Part of the reason for that is because we all have different psychology. We all have different complexes. So you can't just press a button and integrate them. You have to try and understand what they're there for and what the meaning is for your life. Having said that, though, yes, there are specific techniques that are very, very useful. You mentioned basically active imagination there, first of all. That can be very useful. As for the knowledge side of things, yes, Jungian training, and I'm not a Jungian analyst, by the way. I've not gone through that, what those guys do in, say, Zurich. But I know a lot of it is learning as much as you possibly can about fairy tales and myths and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, so that you can perform something that Jung called amplification properly. That was his method of dream interpretation. I don't think that the average person really needs to do that or to worry about that, for exactly the point that you made. It is more instinctive, and your life, all the variables in it, relationships and whatever, are different to other people's. It's just becoming sensitive and more sensitive over time to what's you versus what's other things within the unconscious acting in you, through you, projecting out of you onto other people, and becoming curious about that would be the first step. Normally at that point, the unconscious will then respond to what you're doing, weirdly enough.
What do you mean by this? That if you try to pull health out of the subconscious, the trickster emerges.
So if you were to just ask the unconscious, can you make me healthy, please, mate? It's not going to do that. So the trickster function is there to remind you of, again, it's not quite humility and like that kind of I must bow my head and understand that there's more wisdom to be learned. It's more of a case of you are an animal. You have to understand that you're not more enlightened than anybody else. You seem to have, in that example, this is the trickster speaking, you have a very strong interest in Carl Jung. You want to steal from the unconscious. You want to get health out of it as if it's its problem and not yours. And you also want to take other things from it too, to become more confident, to become more cool, maybe so that you can feel that you're experiencing something more than other people are. I think that's what a lot of people feel about Jung or the Jungian tradition. They must have a kind of depth of knowledge and wisdom and understanding to them. No, not really at all. Not really. And if someone goes in wanting that, the trickster function will be constellated. I'm ripping that quote, by the way, directly out of Marie-Louise von Franz, who was one of those canonizers that we mentioned earlier. But
She wrote an excellent book called The Feminine in Fairy Tales.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, she's one of the best explainers of Jung that there's ever been.
And so what is the approach then? Like, let's say that somebody is recognizes that there are these archetypes and there is something that is pulling them together inside of themselves. and they recognize that perhaps they're not functioning properly, whether they recognize their own complexes or they see some lack in the way that they're interacting with the world. What is the proper approach?
Mhm.
Hold on one second. Somebody just we live in a rural area, and everybody mows their lawns 100% of the time, and somebody has just started mowing. That one's open too. We always joke that they mow in surround sound because there's big yards on 4 sides of us, and so sometimes then they have these big riding mowers, and so sometimes literally it's on all 4 sides that we have people riding heavy machinery, and the time of mowing has begun. It's 11 o'clock on a Saturday. There's no better time.
Yeah. I was recording a video recently too with my father. Very emotional, father-son things flying all over the place, and there was a bloke 4 centimeters away mowing his lawn the whole way. I'm going to have to do ridiculous audio engineering. There are audio. Have you guys heard of Orphonic? I've been using that recently. That takes all the stuff out straight away, basically for free.
No, what did you say it was called?
Orphonic, Auphonic. I use it to remove breaths when I record in front of the microphone. Just cuts it all out. I know
That's
you've
really cool.
very fancy microphones though, so maybe that does it. I don't know.
No, they do not.
Yeah, these things are like 50 years old. But yeah, we've actually gotten some mileage out of the AI processing stuff. There's some modules, but we use DaVinci to edit it, and there's some interesting modules. But I'd try it out for sure.
Yeah.
See if we can get better mileage for sure.
Cool.
Appreciate that.
So, returning to the question, before mowing in stereo began, like, what is the approach? Somebody wants to start doing this and start understanding themselves. What do they do?
That's an extremely difficult question to answer, but it's a brilliant question. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could sort of package something out and invite people to engage with the unconscious in that kind of way? But you can't really do that. Everyone's starting point is going to be different. From what I've seen, people either fall into Jung out of desperation. So they've tried so many different things, different types of therapy, maybe, or doing the rounds around the internet gurus. So Jung's like the last port of call, maybe because Freud's got a bad reputation. So they won't go to him. So they'll go to Jung. Or, and this is really weird, we live in a time that, I don't even need to say it, do I? That there's like a meaning crisis. People feel that there's an aspect of animation and connection that's just missing from their lives. Maybe they were once raised with religion, but Richard Dawkins ruined it for them. That kind of stuff. And a lot of people get into Jung out of that desire for a spiritual connection. There are other reasons to get into Jung too, and everyone's different. So, but that's my point, is what's your starting point? What is it that you feel that you're missing that's drawn you to Jung in the first place? And that's kind of a Jungian / Freudian technique. You look at your libido and where it's sort of gone to, and you can reverse engineer what the intended attempt at health is by projecting your own health onto the image of Carl Jung, as if he can really help you. But that healing potential is within you. What I will say, though, is a wonderful place to begin is with you, with yourself, your own sense of identity. A lot of people don't really seem to have that much of a consolidated sense of self these days. I can't speak for all generations, but I'm 29, and I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people of roughly my age. And that age and younger, there is a problem with sense of identity. It's as if they've got a floating sense of themselves, but nothing to hold on to or ground themselves in. Starting with your own ego psychology is a good place to begin. Ask yourself the rather weird question, who are you? And often out of that question comes a lot of really strange and wonderful things. Now, that's without actually touching the unconscious per se at all. You've just asked into the void, if you like. And in the Red Book, what Jung did was to begin with that question. Where is my soul? Where has it gone? And something replied to him. So that sounds woolly. I'm aware that sounds woolly, but everyone's different. So if you want to go into like particular techniques and things, very happy to do that. But I wouldn't want to give a false, more misleading impression. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. What were you going to say?
Well, this is hopefully I can dovetail onto this. I would like to get into some specific techniques. I think that'd be fun for sure. But I've noticed something really interesting, and this might be because I'm from an older generation to some extent, but I'm getting there anyways. With respect to a lot of the young adults today.
Well, you're not 29 anymore.
I'm not 29 anymore. But when I was in my 20s, for instance, I had a lot of problems, but I did have a really strong sense of self. And I had this firm belief that I am who I am and take it or leave it. And I kind of really believed in that platform as just something that was inherently me. I don't know where it came from, but it is me. I like what I like. I am who I am. But then I had this kind of uncomfortable awakening around my early 30s where I realized that I could actually, well, it kind of started actually with realizing maybe there's some parts of myself that I don't actually like that much. Like maybe I'm kind of an asshole sometimes. And so then maybe through the use of some psychedelics and so forth, I realized I could change those parts of myself if I really attended to them. Like I could actually become a different person, let's say, or at least not be married to this old person that I had gotten used to being. And that's great and everything. And I think I did get some mileage out of that, but it also has resulted in a different set of second order, I don't want to call it pathologies, but anxieties, because now I'm faced with the fact that in every situation, I have a choice of who I want to be in that situation. And that's maybe in some sense what a lot of these younger people are feeling as well, which is like I can be anything, whereas I feel like maybe many generations ago or whatever, you would have just been whatever you were. Like you do what your dad did and that's it, and you kind of have this nice track that you ride on. And I feel like modernity, especially this postmodern era, has just cracked open this limitless sea of possibilities. And in some sense I feel that as well, with my own personal awakening in my early 30s too, where I'm like, oh my God, like I can be anything in any situation. And so this balance between authenticity and possibility is a new source of anxiety.
Mm.
And I'm not sure why I'm just confessing this to you exactly, other than I think it's kind of an interesting downstream effect of the analytic era that we're in. We were just in Vienna over the summer, and it was funny because everybody we'd meet was way into a psychoanalysis, and like everybody's like spending like a good portion of their paycheck, like young people, and they love it, and they're like way into the symbology and interpreting their dreams and all this stuff. But I'm not sure that it has really decreased any anxiety in these people's lives necessarily at the end of the day. And that's what's kind of interesting me about this whole project, is about self-analysis in general, is it seems like a whack-a-mole game to some extent. Like you take care of one thing, but now you've built this whole other layer of concern on top of it at the same time. Like, is it a progressive art form where you actually reach some point? Does anyone ever just get to this perfectly integrated place where they're like, oh, I'm done, I'm good to go, and they're back to that really stable platform of self where they're like, nope, this is just me and I figured it all out? Like, is it teleological in that sense, the Jungian analysis project?
That's the idealistic aspect. Yeah, it's supposed to be teleological. To get there with it, though, thank you for sharing that stuff with me, because I think there's a contrast between what you described with yourself versus the more sort of psychoanalytic cultures. There's I don't want to be unfair to it, but there is a kind of very middle class style, we're into analysis, type of culture that goes around. There's a difference between that and what you described, I feel, if you don't mind me saying, obviously, that you seem to have approached it with grit. You don't tend to really see that in analytical circles. It's quite abstract, but there is a Jung divided life into two stages, and he sort of put the middle point basically where the medievals thought that the middle point of life was, roughly the age 35. And he thought that if you hadn't done what you were supposed to have done by 35, bye-bye, have fun with a midlife crisis. That was his explanation for it, that the unconscious bursts forward in an attempt to try and get you to, rather unfortunately, a lot of the time, live out the different unlived lives that you've hitherto denied or repressed. And I think that's kind of what I meant with the younger generations today. It's not just identity that I think floats and is rather empty a lot of the time. People deny or moralize about their desires and the people who they are supposed to be, or the things that they want to achieve. And rather like the student that you mentioned earlier, if they were very upfront that they want glory, it's like, well, you know, from one side of things, maybe pathological, but also at least you're honest, you know? So when you're younger, you're supposed to, it seems, fulfill certain things. You're supposed. I know some people vary in this. I don't want to cast a paintbrush, but you're supposed to have a relationship with somebody. At the very least, wrestle with the idea of having children, not ignore it, as a lot of people do these days. Get a job that you like, preferably, and work hard. Especially for men, it seems, some kind of status is important for them. And we can moralize things like that away and say, well, we shouldn't need to. And some schools of therapy do that. You're enough. You're on your, you know, you're fine as you are. Yeah, mate, but the instincts are still there, and they're not going to listen to that. And that's what Jung meant by integration. It's not necessarily live them out, it's become conscious of them and come to terms with them. And depending on your, I like to go with a genetic setup with this because of my background, but depending on what you're kind of born with, sort of sets the template, I guess. So what you're describing there about, you know, kind of authenticity versus almost like a pluripotency, that's surprisingly very similar to what Jung said would come up around the second half of life. Things that you should achieve versus then in the second half of life becoming almost, at least on the inside, more pluripotent. What are the things that you've left behind in the pursuit of relationship, status, job, the boring day-to-day stuff, you know? What have you left behind? Is there more to you than that? And I've not reached that stage, so I have to refer to theory, unfortunately. But you know what I mean? What you said matches that, I think, really nicely.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to check back in like 15, 20 years from now and see if I have any wisdom gained from this period of transition, because I do feel stronger as a human being than when I was 30, but I do sense a new set of anxieties attendant to the pluripotentiality of the world that I'm making and the self that I'm making at all times, which I was just never aware of. And it was quite relaxing in my 20s. That part of my psychology was quite relaxing. I feel like there was a lot less tension in my body as a result of it, in some sense. I mean, I still am glad that I'm who I am and that I'm making my way through this into something else. But it's just an interesting piece of the puzzle that I hadn't really thought of until this conversation today. So that's the only reason I'm bringing it up.
Well, I think that there's an interesting feature of maturation, which is that there's a phase of childhood that is kind of idealistic and simple, where there's not really a lot of time spent thinking about who you're going to become. And then there's adolescence, where all of a sudden you break with the previous frame. And that tends to be characterized by a lot of turmoil, where all of a sudden you realize that perhaps the maps that are laid out for you by your family are not the maps that you want to follow. Perhaps you realize that there needs to be some other set of goals or orientations that you need to determine for yourself, and that creates a tremendous amount of tension. And then usually by the time that you graduate college, there's this, or you hit, your early 20s, there's a sense of, okay, at least I kind of know the direction that I'm headed in, and then you can move in that direction, and it just works. You're young, your body works, there's so much time. I think that if you're 22, you look at the world and you're like, well, I'm never going to die. Like, there's so much time. And then by the time that you start to hit 35, 40, 45, you're suddenly transitioning into this other plane where now the question is, oh shit, I am going to die. And there's a finite limit on this. And now it becomes this kind of secondary adolescence in the sense of the things that you decided when you were 15 are no longer fitting. It would be hard for me to imagine somebody who decided something at 15 and they get to 50 and that hasn't changed whatsoever. And so maybe there's this secondary phase of tension that happens because growth is always painful. There's never a situation where growth doesn't have some aspect of like a wound to it. Because if you think about it, even from the physiological aspects of growth, you're breaking old connections, you're having to form new ones, and that is not a it's not I feel like it's not necessarily a comfortable process.
Well, there's the added experience that changes your perception of what you're doing as well. So you might start off when you're 15 and be like, I'm going to be a soldier or something, I don't know, or a doctor. And then over the course of becoming a soldier or a doctor, you will at some point find yourself hopefully faced with the question of what kind of a soldier do I want to be, or what kind of a doctor. And I don't mean like, are you going to be a foot doctor or a brain surgeon or something? I mean like, how are you going to in what way are you going to meet the world in that capacity, in this profession, and how are you going to act? What is the standard? Again, what is your aim? Who are the people you look up to? What is the school of thought that you identify with in whatever profession you're in? As you might, for me, I was like, I want to be a musician, right? Well, what kind of, not like what style of music, but what do you want to do with that music? How do you actually see the world differently that you want to transplant into somebody else's experience when they listen to your music? And that's a really wild transition to have to go through, because you have to align yourself with either some tradition that's come before, or imagine in some Nietzschean sense, this other identity that doesn't even exist yet, and create it in terms of what you're going to put out into the world. And I feel like that's not really encoded in the language of what do you want to be when you grow up. Those things are so far away from your thought when you're an adolescent. So I totally agree with Nastia. It's like a second adolescence in some sense, because you're faced with of this set of constraints that I've chosen, which form of that am I going to follow? That's really interesting. It's like a series of predictable rebirths you could almost plan on occurring, but don't really get a lot of talk at that age, at the early age of development.
Yeah, I'm fully in agreement with that. I think that's a very strong way of modeling things. To me, I'm thinking that real life kind of gets in the way. And to the point about puberty, it's like when I remember being prepubescent as a small child, I remember looking at girls, and girls were icky. You don't go near girls. I like the lads, and I like whatever video game on the PS2 I was playing at the time. And then boom, suddenly you don't ask for it. Your physiology begins to change. Suddenly you develop anxieties you've never had before. Now girls suddenly appear numinous and also terrifying at the same time. And what's going on? It's as if you haven't asked for it, but something is making a demand on you. But we don't know it at the time. It seems it takes a couple decades before we implicitly understand that you can't escape your fate in some way. You could make sure it's not a tragedy, obviously, but there are certain things you're supposed to be and live out. And their stories, that's this, if we're moving back into the archetype, these are things that don't mean literally, but as if in a Lamarckian sense, people have lived out again and again and again and again and again. And now for some reason, you've now got to do it all over again. The eternal life of the species now in you. And yeah, I've spoken with a lot of creative people, and I like people who are fundamentally artistically or musically or whatever inclined first and foremost. And I think people like that suffer the most from what I've seen. That's a big statement, and I'm open to being corrected on it. But the world isn't particularly friendly to people like that. The world favors and rewards people who are more cognitive or intellectual or are more money savvy or whatever. And I guess that creative stuff then has to sort of sit in the unconscious for a while. But I've seen it so many times now that when someone gets overwhelmed with an anxiety or a neurosis of some kind or another, often it's creativity that comes out as like a compensation. Remember this passion you once had? I've not gone away. I've just waited until the nonsense of life has been dealt with, and now you can deal with me, type of thing. And oftentimes that creativity will have within it the healing story or the healing tone or the feeling to make you feel better and to make you feel more of yourself. That was one thing that Jung always encouraged in his patients. And one of the reasons why Jungian analysis from him used to take bloody forever is you do your active imagination, you do your dreams, you do your da 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 da. But then you have to give it physical form. You can paint it or turn it into a song or turn it into a story, as if you've now really birthed something and created something that you can stare into, and it stares you right back to go, I am your legacy. Is that what you were talking about there regarding the sort of that more musical side of things?
Man, I don't know. I was just kind of struck by the thought. I'm thinking about these double rebirths, and you know, one of the other features that you mentioned. It seems to me like you're pointing that the act of actually physicalizing the having a creative output that puts uh, these ex- these transitions into form, that in and of itself is therapeutic, first of all. So when I think about something like my brutalist science building and how it's devoid of any art or symbology or anything, my initial thought when we started the conversation was like, oh, it would be really good for everybody entering the building to be surrounded by some sort of representations that got them to think about the organization of motivational substructures in a way that they can map it onto their practices within that building, whatever art or science that they're undertaking. But there's also the element of the people who are making those. If there was actually an institutional place for this kind of work in society, if we actually institutionally, our institutions valued these sorts of spending projects, then the people who are participating in them would also benefit from it, which would be quite interesting. Because you mentioned like being an artist kind of sucks. I mean, my parents tried really hard to talk me out of being an artist. They're like, your life is gonna suck a lot for all the reasons that you pointed out. Like, it's gonna be really hard. You're not gonna get paid. You're gonna be poor. No one's gonna value what you're doing. It's really, really hard. And like 0.0001% of artists ever manage to make a living doing that, essentially. But it seems like there is a real need inside of most people for some sort of creative output. It doesn't mean they have to be a musician or a painter or anything like that. But there seems like a real role, not just in the participants in the artwork, but in the spending on those sorts of projects for the actual creators themselves, because in some sense it brings the the drywall layer or the wall builder, the construction worker, into that expressive form that heals those people as well, and all of the elements of society, not just the people that are the end experiencers, the audience members of it.
Well, it's crazy because I think that there was a period of time, and I kind of pin this to before the emergence of radio and television, where music and dancing and art seemed to be not the products of some central figure that is the creator that then distributes this work from some central node, but the people at a dinner party gather around whoever plays the piano and everybody sings the songs together. It's not a sense that someone is the musician. It is that we make the music together, that this is part of existence, this is part of life, that everybody paints a little bit, everybody sings a little bit, everybody plays a little bit of music, everybody carves a little bit. Like there's a sense of a constant access to it. And what's happened in this modern age, which is, it must have been in Jung's mind, this thing that erodes people's necessity to participate in the act of creation, so that there are only specific people that are entitled to that. And by virtue of that, it cuts more and more people off from their subconscious.
Yeah, it reminds me of this really funny example I just want to share really quick, which is we both used to work at UCSF in San Francisco. And it's funny because UCSF at the time was like this, I think they view themselves in the Berkeley tradition as this super progressive minded, like they identified that some portion of their building budget should be spent on this project that we're discussing, right? That things had gotten out of hand. We really should create spaces that embody this more cultural, spiritual landscape. We should put some of our budget for every building that's made into the art, right? But the hilarious result of that is that it's way easier for an administration to just, okay, we have $5 million to spend. And they just take that $5 million and give it to some, one particular artist. In the case of the building I worked in, which was the Helen Diller Center at the time. And they just bought this really, god-awful, giant geometric shape thing that cost them several $1,000,000 from some famous postmodernist artists.
They bought an orb.
They bought an orb. They stick it in the basement, and they call it done. It's still a brutalist building. It's still ugly as sin. But now there's this ridiculous $3 million orb in the basement, and that's it, right? Because that's kind of like Nasia's saying. That's the way that we've structured things. Is there's like a guy who makes orbs. Emperor's New Clothes style, everybody somehow agrees that this, I don't know if it's a money laundering operation or what, but everybody agrees to this guy is going to get all of the money for the art. And that's a sort of representation, I think, analogous to the way that we deal with creativity in our society in general. There's people on stage who do the rock star thing. The rest of you stand in the audience and watch them. And that's how we do art. You go and see a painting in a museum, I don't know where I'm going with this rant exactly, but it does seem to play out. I thought that was a really funny example of this, of how people have instinctively identified that there's a need for this, but then somehow been completely subverted in their attempt to actualize it by the status quo, which is this really compartmentalized system of experiencing creation in the world today.
Yeah. 100% with you. I couldn't, got hardly anything to add to that, except to say, Jung went as far as to say that creativity was one of our set instincts that we have. And therefore, if we don't create, it doesn't have to be in the traditional ways, obviously, but if we don't create, we'll get a little bit unwell. And I think the internet is providing a way for a lot of people to tie their creativity into making a living, which is one of the wonderful things about the internet. Whether that's, even little things like making a small little shop on Etsy, or even down to video editing or something, you can bring a piece of your soul to it and get really animated by that. The creativity is a strange thing, because you're right, there's like a status or like a locked off, gate kept part of it. You see the pop star, you see the famous director of a movie or whatever, and they're the 1 in a billion person who got to be that way. Everything else is a total waste of time. That sucks. That absolutely sucks. But at the same time, maybe pause for 1 second. I need to shut that off because someone's trying to annoy the hell out of me. There we go. Be able to pick up with a nice clean crossfade or something there.
We got you.
Yeah, cool. What was I talking? Creativity.
You were saying that the internet has allowed people to become more creative, and then you were saying at the same time, It seems like you were trying to say that there's something about the internet perhaps that is actually aggravating this tendency to look towards still these central nodes of distribution? Because it does seem like although the internet has, and technology in general has given the tools to everybody to be creative, right? So I think about this in terms of synthesizers all the time. The earliest synthesizers were machines that were, in today's dollars, $20,000, $50,000. The earliest computers were also extraordinarily expensive, and so the people that were using them to make something were, again, this upper echelon of people. But now we live at a time where all of the tools are available to everybody. You can make stuff on your phone. You can you can sit in your bedroom and you can make recordings, and yet it doesn't seem like it has necessarily filtered down to a place where everybody is suddenly creative and we live through a brand new renaissance where everyone is an artist, hobbyist, craftsman in their spare time. It seems like most people lose their time to doom scrolling.
It's like very compartmentalized, I guess, to like wrap it back to what I was saying. It just seems like it's like, oh yeah, that's something you do at night. Like it's not part of, like, a lot of people speaking about synthesizers, like I saw a really funny meme on the internet. It was like, an electronic musician is what you become if you live beyond being in bands, basically. Right, because it's a kind of music that you can do in your bedroom at night. You can have your job, you can work in the cubicle and stuff, but it's not really fed back into the actual institutional landscape that most of us exist in, where we have jobs and we go and work at whatever, or maybe we go and we construct buildings, or we work on whatever the heck we do. Everybody's doing some form of that, but it hasn't really resulted in this externalization necessarily of those creative acts. It's not integrated into the landscape that we behold when we go out and go to the strip malls or go to go to our jobs.
Yeah. And one of the unfortunate things too, I feel, is that creativity, oftentimes it's not something you can compartmentalize into an evening. It takes a lot of cognitive effort and energy to do. And the top pop stars and the movie performers and the whatever, that's their main thing that they do, and it exhausts them. I don't think that I'm not going to paint a full paintbrush over this, but a lot of academic psychology and a lot of neuroscience looks at creativity as if it's an enigma. They'll literally say, we don't know where this comes from. And it's stated by many academic psychologists, not everyone is creative. You need to have a certain setup on the big 5 personality scales, very high in openness, for example, to be creative. But that's not what you see. In real life, if you like, being in England, if you go to the pub with someone, you have a few pints, and the persona goes down a bit, people will say the things that they want to do and achieve with their lives. And some of that is the more, going to make some money and have status and whatever. But other parts is, actually, I've always wanted to be a novelist and I've got some really good ideas. And no one has encouraged that, ever. And then they believe, well, I'm not good enough. It's not good enough. And that natural impulse then gets tied in with the status chasing stuff, with the 9 to 5, when it shouldn't be. It's a natural production of products of the unconscious mind. And maybe it's also therefore part of the modern day neurosis we've been talking about, that people aren't in contact with their unconscious mind, so they don't take their creativity seriously. Like Hamlet, they just doubt, and it's not good. Because how maybe we could have a new Renaissance if people really did take that side of themselves more seriously. It makes you wonder.
I mean, I think we have to. It's either that or just doom, right? I feel like we're going through this period where the institutions, by and large, whether it's academia or our democratic republic, they're in some sense failing on their promise to deliver in the modern era. Like, a lot of these things were set up at a point in time where they did what they did really well, but they're increasingly stressed. And I feel like people are becoming alienated from the projects that the institutions are pursuing, which is in some sense outdated. And there's one way to look at that. Like, our friend Jim has been on the podcast talking about how institutions all have a life. Sorry, I'm getting chased around by a fly here. Good Lord.
There's 2 flies.
Just like insane, probably. There's two, like, one way to look at this is like institutions have a lifespan. They're just like creatures. Like, they're born, they have an adolescence, they have a maturity, and then they have decline. That may be so, and in fact, that seems to play out historically often. But with something like, I'm just going to go with our country, the United States of America, it would be a real bummer if that institution ceased to exist. I mean, what comes next could be awesome as well, but that period, historically speaking, where one giant nation's institutional structure fails is often quite cataclysmic and results in terrible starvation, disease, war, terrible things, right?
So this is actually a really interesting contrast between Renaissance and Revolution, because I think that both things are transformative, and one is transformative by being soaked in blood, and the other one is transformative by being soaked in light. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I'm always, whenever Jim's talking about this, I'm always just like, well, goddamn, like, there's got to be a way to repair the project in such a way that it becomes soaked in light and rejuvenated, right? Like, is there an elixir for this?
well, I think that, James, your point is that the elixir is to become in contact again with the subconscious and to recognize that there is a distinct tension between perhaps the actions that the culture induces you to take versus the actions that your internal I wishes that you would take. And so, like you're saying, you go to the pub with somebody and you start talking, and it turns out that, they do want status and money, but really there's this novel that they want to write. Or maybe somebody lives in some tiny apartment in the city, but what they really want to do is they want to live on a piece of land outside of the city and have cows or something. And so, like, what is the process this leads us back to the question of what is the process by which people can start to tap into these archetypes in order to actually generate some kind of motive force inside of them that allows them to slowly reawaken and to come into something that has more light in it than the current constrained world that a lot of people live in.
One of the unfortunate things about instinct is it's very different to us, our normal conscious mind. So it will push. And the word that you used earlier, teleology, it's as if they have some kind of teleology, or at least the archetype does when it kicks off instincts to try and get there. So we have to, unfortunately, deal with that first. That has to be at the very least looked at first. I think a lot of people, and it's not their fault, it's partly the way that Jung is represented on the internet. A lot of people think that we need to sort of not be in the material world at all. There's a wonderful landscape of dreams and symbols. That's the real world. Not really. That's kind of, you've turned reality into a Gnostic hellscape at that point. Jung was very clear that we have to live in this world. We have to meet the instinctive demands that are put upon us. But there's more to us than that. What I would say, because sometimes language like this can be really weird, sometimes people can find it quite numinous, exciting. One of the things that everyone can do, if they do think that they are creative, but maybe they haven't lived that part of themselves yet, just sit down and just try and do something. Maybe it is write a line of a novel, or you'll start to play the guitar or paint something. And as you do it, the rational mind, it might go, this is very silly. What are you doing? I don't have the energy, the motivation, or the animation to do this right now. But realize it's not you doing it. Something else is doing it, and something else thinks, regardless of what your conscious mind thinks, it's a really good idea to do it. Humans do irrational, instinctive things all the time. I imagine to the most rational person on earth, what couples will do at night in their own bedroom will appear to be extremely weird. Why do we do that? But people don't tend to question it. It's part of life. So too is creativity. And that's part of it, is it's not just accessing archetypes or something in a rather, because that can be confusing for people, I feel, that they want something from it, but it's relatively vague. All you got to do is take the unconscious seriously. It's there. It wants something from you. And if you take it seriously, it starts to take you seriously too. And often you'll find that libido, that energy, that animation will begin to flood forward, and you'll start to do creative things. It's a really wonderful thing when people begin working on their own personal myth and the Jungian style of stuff. Most of the time, the form of creativity rushes to the forward more or less straight away. And that can be a way of accessing archetypes, accessing instincts, especially if it's more narrative based. If someone does have a novel that they want to write, maybe they've been sitting on ideas for ages, well, there's a reason why your unconscious chose that story. And while you leave it unauthored, it's going to be sitting there in potential, and you won't really know what its message is for you, or maybe even the world. Who knows? So just take the unconscious seriously has to be the starting point.
Oh man, I love that actually. That's a really different way of looking at a very common problem that I face, and I think all artists face, which is, oh man, I've got to shift gears from doing my ordinary stuff like washing the dishes and taking care of podcast releases and whatever it is. And now I got to go into my studio and start working on this project. And there's this huge inertia to that starting point. And I think that, and it's very difficult and you fight your way through it. Maybe you just toughen yourself over time and you're like, I'm just going to sit on this desk and pick up the guitar, whatever it is. And it works. It always works, but it never gets easier to cross that barrier in my experience. Like, you still have to kind of muscle your way through it. But I think that the reason that it's so difficult is because there's some conscious process in your mind that thinks that you have to do something declarative, that's like you're gonna have to invent some new way to be that's special that nobody's ever thought of before. And you know, we live in this age that tells us that everybody's special and everything, like you have to, and you're like looking at yourself like, oh man, I don't know if I have any special ideas. Like, I have, you know, I guess I can start playing the guitar, but I don't know if it's special necessarily. And that holds you back because you're like, well, damn, like somebody else is special, is actually pulling this off. But I love the idea of just surrendering to the fact that this will take care of itself to some extent, because it is true, and that's what you find through experience. But every time you go to face that starting up again, you still have that conscious process that's trying to tell you that you have this really difficult task ahead of yourself that you need to master, and master might not be the right word, that you need to wrangle and direct, when the reality of the situation is you just need to surrender, release, and give over to that unconscious process, those unconscious voices that are deep inside of you. And if you just give them space to be, then you will find it to be quite productive ultimately. And so maybe if we can train ourselves, and I'm going to put this into practice in my own life too, it's like when I have that time to do something creative, you know, whenever it is throughout the day, end of the day, whatever, that I can train myself to think of it as actually letting go, as opposed to having to grab this huge bull by the horns and, you know, really fight this thing into existence. Like, I feel like there is some productive mindset change about letting go, to like give, like just like let go into the mystery, as the mighty Van Morrison said, you know, something like that.
Yeah, that's so well put. It's liberating because it's not you that's producing it. There is an element, obviously, of technical skill that you build up via habit and exposure to other artists and whatever. That's all absolutely fine, but you're discovering it. You're not authoring it. It's coming through. You get to take credit for it, obviously, in society, but not within yourself. So yeah, and the ego shouldn't take responsibility for something that's not theirs. I mean, to the point about the algorithm and doom scrolling and things like that, no one takes responsibility for that with their ego, except, oh, I've got a lack of willpower. You just sit there and you let an unfolding of instinctive energy just happen. It should be the same thing with creativity. And I like the way that you put it, that it was some kind of mystery, because it is. You don't know where the song's going to go, where it's going to go. So that's exciting.
You know, it's funny because like when I was younger, I used to think that a lot of that anxiety, when I stared at the empty piece of paper, proverbially, I thought that anxiety was based in technicality, because I did have a long ways to go technically. You know, I didn't quite know how to do, you know, to play the instrument, or how to, you know, orchestrate or arrange a harmony or whatever. But I was kind of shocked to realize that once I actually mastered all that stuff, the anxiety still existed, which points to the fact that it has a much more obvious answer to it than just get better at playing the guitar or something like that, and you'll have no issue with sitting down to write stuff. It's quite interesting. I have another direction to go in, but I want to make sure, Nastya, that you don't have any thoughts on this train first, or you, James.
From none clear yet, but perhaps something will come up. James, do you have any?
Wherever you want to take it.
All right,
I kind
Charlotte,
of
take
want to
us away.
circle back on, you said something really interesting at the beginning about how we were talking about science, and we were talking about teams in science, and how people don't really feel like there's lots of different teams, maybe, I don't want to use the word competing, but I'm going to use the word competing for an approach. And I think it really can seem like that. I'm going to keep this to physics, since that's the discipline I know the most about, I would say. I actually think after all these years that there are a number of teams competing, but that there's one team that is so popular that you wouldn't know there are even other teams out there. And it took me a really long time to see that happening. Um, what do you think a very healthy ecosystem would look like in science? Would there be a lot of different schools of thought and some real sense of tradition in your school of thought and these competitions between these approaches, or is there always going to be one dominant theme?
We could potentially look at the work on paradigms, Kuhn's work with that, which seems to, at the very least on the surface, explain a lot of stuff. And scientist isn't just a job, is it? It's also an identity. And that's one of the reasons why people cling to their basic teams, whether that's one interpretation of the collapse of the wave function versus another, or whatever it happens to be. I can only really speak from personal experience here, but I think I said it earlier. I felt lonely as a PhD student because I looked around at these real top end labs. I was pleased because in my masters I had to prepare all the yeast media myself. I was a peasant, but on the PhD, there are people there to do that for you. And you could do RNA-seq, which was very, very expensive stuff. All these bioinformatic pipelines. This is all really, really cool. But why am I here? It's as if there was like an existentialness that was missing. And I don't think I was after a team per se, but I spontaneously, which is in hindsight, this was a very Jungian thing to do, but it was an accident. I turned to some of the earliest scientists. Francis Bacon was my absolute favourite. As if there was some kind of resonance, as if I could ground myself in the mission and tradition of science, like an ancestor. That the people who came before us, we're not directly descended from necessarily, but we share the same mission. The same things drive us, and I was probably relatively unique in that. I looked around at my peers; they had no problem walking around, doing their experiments, going home, watching Netflix, going to sleep. And I'm sitting there thinking, what is the meaning of everything that we are doing in this scenario? But I know that not everyone is happy, and most people aren't happy. So they all probably had individual things to deal with themselves. So I don't know. I really like the tradition of science that we're not supposed to have teams. Everyone chips in bits of data, and there's papers, and we all of us individually contribute to the collective knowledge of science. But maybe it's less to do with depth psychology and more to do with money. Would be the answer to your question. I don't know.
I
Because
don't
of
know.
grant.
I mean, I think that grants and money have a lot to do with it, but I actually do think that there is an incredibly powerful lineage that runs through science. And if you start to read any history, you start to see it. Something that I really found interesting is that, so if you look at Newton's Principia, it's written in a very, very specific way. So he has all of these sections, and each section is a little proof. It's kind of this chunk of thought, and they're all numbered, and he makes some conclusion, and then he moves on to the next one, and sometimes he'll refer back to them in this numerical way because it's an ordered structure of thought. I haven't found any treatises, I don't know, any documents that precede Newton that are written in the same way, because it's this very, very organized structure. Maybe Spinoza is similar, but that's like in the philosophical tradition, and so Newton's kind of blending this science with philosophy. And you can see that after Newton, there is a transformation where the people who identify themselves as being part of this tradition, this Newtonian tradition, write like Newton. So in your video about Jung and Pauli, you mentioned Sommerfeld. And Sommerfeld is actually one of those lineage scientists where he has the honor of having, I think, the greatest number of Nobel laureates that have ever come out of anybody's lab. And so he directly mentored, I think, 6 or 7 Nobel laureates. And then those Nobel laureates went on to mentor a bunch of other Nobel laureates. And so he has, I think he's either the father or the grandfather of nearly 30 Nobel Prizes. And I went, because I was trying to figure out, Sommerfeld was basically the guy who made the first modification to Bohr's atomic model. So Bohr takes Planck, puts Planck onto the Rutherford model of the atom, which is the solar system model, and he's like, aha, it's not just a solar system, it's a quantized solar system. And so he includes this weird piece where you mentioned that, technically a classical particle in orbit should decay very, very quickly into the nucleus. I think the lifetime of an atom should be like 10 to the negative 11 seconds if it obeys classical dynamics. And he's like, well, there's stationary orbits where that doesn't happen. He doesn't explain why it doesn't happen. He's just like, it must be so. And so he adds this quantization, but the quantization doesn't deal with this Zeeman effect, which is the fact that when you put sodium into a magnetic field and then you look at the lines that it produces in a spectral diagram, that it has this doublet, and the doublet splits into, I think, 10 different lines in a sufficiently high magnetic field. Nobody knows why this is, and so Sommerfeld is like, okay, we're starting to modify the orbital dynamics and we're putting them into some new form. And so I wanted to go read his paper because I was trying to figure out something about the basic. We were studying spin, and I was trying to figure out how he was conceptualizing spin. And it's Newton. He basically goes through it. His entire paper, his biggest paper, is structured exactly in this tradition of Newton. And then it got me thinking about why quantum mechanics became so popular and why it was taken to be such a transformative, new kind of science. And I have the feeling that the people who were the greatest minds of that generation saw themselves as being in the lineage of Newton, in the sense that they were the next vanguard, and they were inventing a new kind of physics the same way that Newton did. And so I feel like what you see when you look through the history of quantum mechanics is that you do see a lineage, and you see a lineage that traces to a very specific type of thinking, and that traces to a very specific position of the thinker in the world. And so I do think that in the modern day, that kind of tradition of thinking has disappeared because most people, this is going to sound offensive, but most people are technicians. Most people show up, they have a PI, the PI is like, run these experiments, and they understand the specifics of why you would run that experiment.
I remember when I pointed this out to Nastya in graduate school, how utterly angry you got with me. I was like, Nastya, I don't think most of the people here are scientists. I think they're all technicians for the most part. And she was like, you can't take that away from them.
Well, I think that I was deeply frustrated because...
Which I get it. I totally get it.
Well, I was deeply frustrated because when you were in graduate school, you're tied to a mentor. And we're talking about this like 3 years in, and I think that he's probably right, but I'm 3 years into a program that I want to finish as quickly as possible, and I'm stuck with a mentor that is definitely a technician. And so I think that was what the pain point was, is I was like, I can't deal with this right now because it's too threatening to the worldview that I have.
But what you mean is that there's a creative aspect to being a scientist truly, right? There is actually this transformative element where you see the world new and you have to make maybe a whole new framework by which that happens. That's kind of what Newton did, and that's what the quantum mechanicists saw themselves as doing too. They're this archetypical configurers of reality, right? It's not like the way you guys have all been thinking about it all these years. It's totally different. We're going to need a whole new frame for that, which is archetypically creative in the sense of the artist giving the world a new way of seeing something. And that's obviously an extremely high standard to set. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, people working in labs are just, cranking.
They are, but I think that there is a sense of lineage. Like, I think they can crank because they're part of a lineage that is accepted as a given. And I think that the experience that you had where you looked around and you were like, well, hold on a second. What is the larger thing that we're doing here? Is actually the step that one must take in order to be able to find an interesting question in the first place. Because otherwise you're just cranking on a lineage that somebody has given you, and they haven't told you that it's a lineage. You're literally given this thing, and it's not given to you in the context of a larger whole. It's just, look, we're on this path, and we don't know who built the path, And we don't really care who built the path, but it's obvious the path is here and there's the next step that we can take. And we're just going to keep taking this next step. And that, I think, is the experience that you had. Which you look around and you're like, what are we doing? Like, why? Who built this path? What is the path that we're on?
Yeah.
Why are we on it?
That is, well, you probably didn't intend it this way, but on a deep level, that feels very confirming for me, actually, because I've never heard a scientist talk like that before, meaning you two. So to have that de facto sort of recognized, that's a very nice experience. And weirdly enough, it was basically that led to, I've been public about it on the internet, a whole host of psychosomatic symptoms that came over me, and properly falling into the Jung stuff fully. I'd already been orbiting his stuff for a good few years, but I felt that there was a missing human element to me and what I was seeing in the scientific landscape around me. And Jung offered that linking bridge back to something that was more alive, that would breathe, and there was sort of like a bigger mission. Because we are, if we look back over the history of science, we're aiming towards something. I don't know what it is necessarily. You know, we can look at myth and religion and whatever to maybe get a clue, but we don't know. But something's driving us. Nietzsche thought that there was no such thing as a will to truth. Scientists were motivated by something else, never by truth. Because why not untruth? And it's the same thing. I know for me, I craved lineage. It didn't have to be a literal, like, father archetype, if you like, father, grandfather. That is important. But I needed to feel that almost like we're not just dropped here out of time. There has been a time before us. And it's like it's reaching forward to touch us. But a lot of us are just dissociated from it. So thank you for that model. And I agree with that 100%.
Well, I think that Nietzsche's idea that there isn't someone who is reaching for truth may be, I don't want to say that it's universally accurate, but I do think that from what I've seen, there's this meme in the world right now, which is that scientists all want to make discoveries, and so there is a frame that says that the existing framework that we have for parsing the worlds, let's say we can pick quantum mechanics because I know that it's something that you've looked into, it's something that we've been studying. So there is this existing understanding that quantum mechanics is the most accurate possible representation of the world that we have ever had, down to, 13 decimal points. The theory predicts reality. And so I think that there is this very strong lineage that lives outside of quantum mechanics, where there's lots of people that are saying, hey, hold on a second. It may be accurate, but there's severe problems with the interpretations that we make. Like in your Pauli video, I almost laughed out loud when you said that, when you described the emergence of the quantum numbers, where it's this set of numbers that need to be in the equations in order to describe what is observed. And yet, no one has any kind of physical interpretation for what those numbers mean. They come to them as this mana from God that allows them to make equations that work, and now we have this system that is mechanically functional, predictive, perfect. And so I think that the idea that that the experts in the world all want to come up with some different way of seeing things, because that's what science is, it's about the seeking of truth, isn't necessarily accurate, because I think that there is a very strong pressure to maintain the preeminence of the lineage of quantum mechanics in the form that it was given, because it is a hallmark of our modern ability to make new science. It's not Newtonian mechanics. It's something completely different and not understandable. And that's the thing that's valuable. And so if somebody comes in and starts to say, well, hey, maybe we've misunderstood this. Like maybe there is something that is quantized in nature, but it's not spooky or paradoxical, but it's in fact quite legible. That's not a perspective that is welcome, because there isn't a search for understandable truths. There's a search for paradoxical truths. Does that make sense?
I'm seeing almost like a circumambulation around this concept of creativity at the moment, that maybe it isn't truth. You're right. Maybe truth and the creative act are one level deep, synonymous with each other. It seems from the stuff that I've seen on your guys' channel so far, you very clearly value that side of science, the general creative side. Not that you don't value the technician side of stuff. That's very important and that pushes things on. But like in the Young Pauli video, Pauli turned around and was like, one, this stuff is really strange, and two, I couldn't have come up with the things that I came up with without a creative act that my ego had nothing to do with. It was as if this movement from 3 to 4 just had to happen, the postulation of the fourth quantum number, as per the exclusion principle. So maybe that's it. Maybe science is just the way in which a lot of us now are pushing forward with that creative instinct. Maybe it's not gone away. It's just transmuted itself into different forms. It's a hypothesis. I don't know.
Well, and I think that there's also an instinct towards glory. Because if what you're doing is you're simply taking some kind of old knowledge, whether it's about, action reaction, or it's about that things behave classically, and you are saying, no, that is not the limits of the world. We have access to some esoteric knowledge that is new. Then what you have done is you have created your own pantheon. And you're no longer subservient to King Newton. Now you get to share the throne and say, yes, Newton is king of the classical world, but we are the rulers of the new world, which is far more true than anything that Newton could have said. And I think that that's mixed in both with this drive towards creativity, but it also is the drive towards glory, because what glory is there in just being a technician in Newton's court who just figures out that you can take his equations, apply them to three-dimensional harmonic systems, and then derive quantization from the fact that objects do appear to have fundamental harmonics in them.
It also seems to call back to your statement about Silicon Valley earlier, too, because I feel like the same kind of thing might be happening there, where the default assumption amongst the people who have the biggest microphone in the world right now, like people in Silicon Valley, is that, AI is going to revolutionize and transform the world, and like the future is AI and stuff. But it's like, well, I mean, of course you think that because you build AI systems, but is that really what anybody else wants to see the future of the world look like? Like, it seems almost in some sense like it's a very
it's a motivated reasoning that cements your own glory.
Yeah.
Because if you can tell people that you have done something new and transformative, and enough people believe in it, then you cement it at the center of the next cultural era. And so if quantum mechanics had been rationalized, if they had been like, look, there has to be a physical basis for these things, and we cannot stop thinking about what that physical basis is, because we will then abandon the project of science, we would have perhaps gone into a completely different direction. But instead they were like, no, it is completely unknowable. Anybody who says that they understand quantum mechanics doesn't really understand it. Continue crunching the numbers. We will produce equations that are progressively more exact. And they have, but there is this huge underbelly of immateriality and unknowability that is inherent in the system.
Meaninglessness?
Yes, literally, like in the most exact way, right? Because if you have an equation and it has no meaning, and you're like, this is how the universe works, it is an equation that does not have any point of contact with reality, I don't even know what you've done. But then with the AI example that Shiloh just made, it's also really fascinating, because if everybody who's designing these systems is telling you that they have designed intelligence, and they're telling you that they have designed this godlike creature, but you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know that you have. the arc of the world will follow the ideology that is popular. And so I think that they do parallel each other really neatly, where you have a group of people that have come up with something, and then they narrativize it for everybody else. And then everybody else takes that narrative and then just lives with it, despite the fact that it might be contrary to instinct.
Yeah. And to the point about glory with this, it's not just in the people who are that way inclined. All the rest of us are taught and then implicitly almost need deity-like figures to look up to. Those pioneers of quantum mechanics, obviously, everyone knows their names. They're untouchable geniuses. And maybe they are at one level. Closer to home, it's Charles Darwin. You know, in biology, I was stunned when on my PhD time I looked into Darwin as a man, and how more or less everything that we are taught about him, the fact that he invented the theory of evolution, the fact that he destroyed Lamarck's, none of it is true. And he didn't really want to push his theories out as some kind of anti-church or pro-enlightenment. He seemed to be just a nice bloke who loved collecting beetles, who was a bit obsessed. And it's like it takes the oomph out of it, but for some reason, us as people require that mythological process. When we look back at our mythic ancestors, that's Jung territory again, straight away. I think of Silicon Valley too. I wonder about simulation theory stuff. You know, they're all on some kind of circuit board somewhere because the probability says it's probably true. No, it doesn't. You've not looked at the numbers yourself. And what's led you to believe that without doing that rigorous checking yourself? It's as if it's another spontaneous myth that provides something for you, some implicit metaphysics, or even maybe a way of regulating the kind of inflation that might come with the belief that you are generating the next phase of consciousness, as per what a lot of these people believe about artificial intelligence. People are irrational all the time, but it's masked in rationality. You don't have to do too much digging, though, to get just under the surface. It's weird being a person, especially in this age.
Yeah. You said something really interesting about both Darwin and simulation theory. And maybe there's interesting things in both directions. And
one thing that's really cool about Darwin is he wasn't a scientist, which makes him a really interesting archetypical science deity. Like, he came out of like a divinity school, and he was like basically a bug collector, and I don't know. I actually I love Darwin for that reason, in some sense, as this archetypical science hero, because he seems like a guy who just noticed something cool about the world. And of course, you're right. Like, a lot of other people were working on similar ideas, and he ended up getting connected with them, and he was part of a much bigger ecosystem. And for whatever reason, humans can only handle monolithic figures in terms of the way they remember history. But
I think
I do love the guy.
there's something really, really crazy that happens with Darwin's theory of evolution, though, which is that what it does is it takes the eventual formulation of a species and reduces all appearances to the product of random chance interacting with the environment. So evolution, through the lens of Darwin, is simply shaped by a random walk that is then somehow molded by nature. Fitness is kind of the god of Darwinian biology. And I think that fundamentally that formulation, what it does is it removes the influence of archetypes, it removes the influence of culture, and it removes the influence of will. And so I think about this a lot in terms of instinct and in terms of desire, because I think that if you were to rewind the clock and imagine that you are sitting on Earth 2 million years ago before the first upright hominids emerge. And so you're some undifferentiated primate group, from which 2 million years later, you will have us sitting at this Zoom call having a conversation about archetypes. To me, there's no way that that separation even begins to happen on a random level alone. I think that there is, of course, some random question of mutations and fitness that fits really, really nicely with our biochemical models of inheritance. But there is this archetypal process, too, of choice that cannot be removed from our understanding of what evolution looks like. Because if we remove that, then we're stuck with this new difficult problem of how to explain the place that we have gotten to. But if you go back in time and you look, like, what is the first inkling of separation? It's tool use. It's the fact that some primates develop tools and then start to iterate on those tools and then start to do more and more complex things with those tools, and other primates don't. And you can say that that's driven by just some random mutation that produces some new area of the brain that then is able to do it. But from where does the desire to do it emerge?
Mm.
And I think that it's this like unconscious archetype process.
Yeah. Yes, that would move us from Jung's earlier work on the archetype that we've been circling this whole conversation through to the stuff that he worked with Pauli on. The archetype always was linked to instinct, and that's fair enough. I think it's pretty easy to make a case for that. You could argue if it's just another classification of instinct or something, but it's okay. Jung's more mystical side of stuff was then moving beyond instinct, or really beneath instinct, and seeing these things as more universal structuring patterns or forms. And really he got that from Pauli. In the video, the Jung Pauli video, I describe a few examples from Pauli, but there are tons if you read Atom and Archetype, the letters between the two men. Beta decay, from the type of radioactive decay, random particles leaving the nucleus at an unknown but time-bounded time, a half-life, seems to represent quite nicely at a symbolic level what Jung spoke about regarding the release of material from the self, the capital S self, the chief archetype of them all within our own lives, an unknown but time-bounded time, a bit like a half-life. I'm skipping details there because some of it's in the video, but both men did think, what if these things weren't instinct, but they were structuring forms? Very interestingly, you guys are probably familiar with Michael Levin's work with the
Yeah, we
Yeah, we were just hanging out with him yesterday, actually.
Oh, cool. His stuff's really interesting because he speculates that there very well could be very similar kind of structuring forms in a thing that he calls the Platonic space. That it's not just evolution doesn't develop certain traits of cognition, let's say, as to your point about tool use. Instead, it further embodies preset forms. And I find his results really interesting, but I wonder if it's not a Platonic space, it's an unus mundus, as per Jung Pauli. He's actually uncovering evidence for. That would be, I hope he has. That's very cool. That means he can win the Nobel Prize. So but it's difficult to prove. I think of the story of evolution. I think of the eclipse of Darwinism, sort of towards the last decade of the 1800s, and then the modern synthesis, and how cheeky the modern synthesis is. Ronald Fisher et al. In the 1920s going, well, look, population genetics shows that the random mutation stuff is sufficient to explain change. Great. What do you mean, Ronald? I know you're a very based individual. You basically invented statistics for biology, but sufficient? That doesn't exclude other mechanisms. Like, for example, a more Lamarckian style. If with epigenetic inheritance we can find a way in which epigenetic changes could become genomic, that would be exciting. Suddenly Lamarck wasn't wrong. Or I really like the hypothesis from John Joe McFadden about quantum evolution. It's like a choice, but based on entanglement from a part of the genome with glucose or with lactose, deciding which direction it wants to go. And he's got many ramified hypotheses and stuff like that. But that speaks to the point about creativity too, doesn't it? If the book is closed on evolution, well, we're all going to be technicians forever if we work in that field. There's nothing left to discover.
Well, I think that there's another aspect of this, which is that at around the same time in the early 20th century, mathematics kind of ate science. And so you can see this transition happen in the physics papers, where prior to maybe 1905 or so, like there are definitely papers that have mathematics in them, even for physics, but a lot of it is trying to wrestle with how these systems work. Like people are trying to come up with etheric models, and obviously like Maxwell has come up with the field equations, Heaviside has filtered them down to like a small collection of equations that are really functional, and so we do have all of these mathematics that are very, very useful. The Industrial Revolution is developing, and yet when you're reading fundamental physics papers, they're really trying to figure out from the basis of experiments what the hell is happening. Like how is, in J.J. Thomson's cathode ray stuff, what is happening at the cathode? What is inside the tube? How is it interacting with the ether? What does it mean for something to have mass? And they're very physical questions in the sense that there's this crazy paper by Thomson in, I think, like 1907, where he's trying to he's trying to derive the idea of mass as being an interaction of vortices in the ether. And then by like 1928 or 26, like when Dirac and Schrödinger and Heisenberg have worked out matrix mechanics, and they've realized, and Pauli as well, like these people have realized that there are more advanced mathematical tools that can be used to describe nature, the discipline shifts entirely. And if you read Dirac's work, it's literally just pages and pages and pages of equations with a couple of sentences on every page that are like, from this previous equation follows this next equation. And to me, that same thing in some ways happened inside of biology too, where you develop statistics, you derive mathematics of population genetics, and you're able to say that there's an aspect of the world that can be described in mathematics, and that's the part of the world that's important. And everything else becomes almost just this kind of detritus that floats on top. It's like we just haven't figured out the equations for how to describe it yet, but eventually we will, and then we can fold it into the model, but we do have these equations that seem to be very accurate. And so I think that kind of what you're pointing to is that there is a part of the world that can be described mathematically and statistically, but there's another part of the world that is very, very real, and yet completely is mathematically and quantitatively elusive. And we have no way of bridging those things together, because anything that can't be described in mathematics is not viewed as being scientific.
Yeah. Real depth psychology would be a prime example of that. You can't do mathematics on the psyche. It's impossible. You can infer it. If the psyche is an epiphenomenon of neurons, you can infer it sort of that way on firing rates and whatever. But you can't even really do science, controlled experiment on the mind. How do you control for even the element of suggestion as per hypnosis in a controlled experiment? You can't. You kind of have to approach it from sort of weird ways. And on your point about maths, Jung has a wonderful line in which he said that statistics was numerology. And I really like that, because for a lot of people, yeah, it is. If we think of epidemiology, a field I don't get on with particularly well because it does look like numerology to me, you defer, what do the numbers say? It's like, what do the stars say? Oh, they say this? Okay. Then I'm going to trust that. I'm going to live my life in this particular way. It's almost superstitious. So yeah, if these random statistical tests say that, well, natural selection is sufficient, well, that's it then. The statistical tests. But that's not how life works. There are so many things that mathematics is off limits to. Psyche
and
is
not only that, but like off limits to and invisible when you are trying to formulate the equations.
Yeah. Different tools for different things. Like the scientific method is relatively new, 400 years-ish, comes out of the broader empirical tradition. But even that's not the only tradition that we have. And for example, an emotional experience or an affective experience that we have, we can describe that broadly mathematically. There's a quantitative element to it. I feel extremely angry or a little bit angry. But beyond that, you can't do it. We need different tools. And with depth psychology, those tools are fundamentally, you build the best model that you can, and then you leave it at the door and you use your phenomenology and ongoing experience. And do the things that we do have a positive effect or a negative effect? But you can never claim absolute truth. And I think that upsets a lot of people. But on the flip side, it's always confused me, and this isn't my core domain of speciality, but stuff like M theory or string theory or whatever, which is purely mathematical at base, that you could never possibly test fully, from my understanding. Why is it that people just accept those things as true when the scientific tradition was always based on, prove it to me, I want to see it? It seems it's more, this is being cynical, more like we've created our own metaphysics now at one level, and that's enough. Maybe that's what the mission of science is pushing towards for some people, because it becomes weird at that point.
But this is the lineage question, right? Because I think that there is a lineage for whom mathematics ate the world. And the ability to conceive of more and more beautiful and elegant mathematics is the goal in and of itself. And I actually think that this brings us really neatly to simulation theory. Because if you live in a real world where there are real consequences, where, yes, like, the world is probabilistic to some degree. And so there is a sense of there being some, I think that quantum mechanics is very popular for that reason, because it does seem to describe something that is true, where you can stand at some point, and then in front of you is a collection of options that you can take, and there's some probability that you will take the next step. And so it does map onto our psychological experience in many ways. But I think that the idea that everything can be reduced to some computation somewhere, and that the mathematics that describe the computation do not have to be bounded to reality, is the exact ground from which simulation theory is born. Because if the universe is described by mathematics that have no bearing on physical reality, then the only conclusion that you can make is that there is some algorithm somewhere running on some substrate that has established this as being the foundational principles along which the world unfolds. And the same way that you cannot detect, the Earth moving through the luminiferous ether, you also cannot detect the substrate of computation upon which the world unfolds. But because the mathematics is there, the only conclusion that you can make is that there must be one. And that, I think, is the lineage, because I think that you can trace another lineage that goes back to like Goethe and Descartes, where they're saying that, no, hold on a second, like there's something different here. Like even for something as simple as a rainbow. Like, do you know about Goethe's like inverse rainbow?
No.
So there is a kind of rainbow that comes from a ray of light that falls into darkness, which is the Newtonian rainbow, which is Roy G. Biv. But there's also a kind of rainbow that comes from a ray of darkness falling into light, which has different colors. So if you take, instead of putting a light in a box and then letting a little aperture open that falls through your prism in a dark room, you get your Newtonian rainbow. If you're to take a light and then cast the shadow through the prism, what you end up seeing is like yellow and teal on one side and orange and red on the other. And if you mix those colors, you actually get purple, magenta. And like magenta isn't supposed to exist. It's supposed to be this emergent color that doesn't exist in the rainbow. But it turns out that there's a different inverse rainbow that is observed in inverse conditions to Newtonian conditions that produces a different spectrum. And this is a lineage that isn't part of the mainstream scientific story. And I think that it is still this lineage that persists of just, hey, like we don't have the full story. We haven't really grasped the full physical reality. And we probably should go back and re-examine it in order to figure it out. But the simulation theory is very popular because I think it feeds into this idea of kind of meaninglessness, of the death of the archetypes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you could comment on that absence of a supervisor for these metaphysical conclusions that fall out. It's like if the conclusion is that we're all living in a simulation, or if the conclusion is that, Big Bang Theory, heat death of the universe, like these seem like really unproductive conclusions in some sense. Like, regardless of whether they're logically argued, are they like serviceable metaphysical destinations that we can actually use? And there's nobody outside of those theoretical spaces to step in and be like, well, that's obviously wrong, not because of any of the logic that you used to get there, but because the conclusion is completely untenable. Like, for instance, like simulation theory. Okay, it doesn't get you out of the question of how to actually act in the world in a productive manner. Like, it just kicks the can down the road. It's like, all right, well, somebody outside of the simulation is choosing all of these things for you. How does that work? What are they up to? What are their motivations? What are they doing? And it ultimately comes back to, well, they're probably the same as yours. And now you're back at the beginning again. Like, okay, well, what do we do in this universe that we actually find ourselves in? It just seems the same with the heat death of the universe. It's just like, or the Big Bang. It's like, okay, so you're telling me there wasn't a universe before the Big Bang? And they're like, no, there was maybe a universe before that too. And it's like, well, how did that one get there? And why does it have atoms or doesn't have atoms or whatever? You're still left with all the same questions. They just seem like ultimately unproductive metaphysical conclusions at the end of the day. And there's nobody outside to comment on it because the expertise is grounded in the tradition in which it's arisen.
Yeah. I feel that with the simulation theory stuff, it's like an illegitimate myth because it's so obviously not a purely rational thing. You have to take, even unconsciously, an ontological preference in order to take a view like that. It reminds me of a Gnostic worldview, but without the ramifications or the ethics or really anything else. We're within a created universe. Great. And we can't know the truth outside of it. Great. That's very similar to Gnosticism. There's a part of us that might feel like we are trapped in something, maybe. But I think for a lot of people, it might be providing a metaphysic. There's a creator, and therefore there's I don't know what it is, but there's a purpose to why we're all here. And to your point about basing things on pure mathematics, I just think of Pythagoras straight away. One of the original, it must have been very, very weird. I know Pythagoras was into all kinds of strange things, but to stare into the beauty of mathematics and see that beauty right back at you again is a thing I think so many mathematicians feel, starting with those pre-Socratics. You look at Euler's identity, which is gorgeous. I don't know why it's gorgeous, but it just is. But if mathematics is the only connection that we have, or some people have, to the transcendent, whatever that happens to be, yeah, you're likely to get your own metaphysics is going to be limited by it. But there's more to it than that. Even Plato thought there was more to it than that. He loved the mathematics, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and everything else. But there was more. There was the experiential side than just that abstraction. Even someone like Sir Roger Penrose, he has elements of it, but then far more in his worldview, where he points to mathematics and says, hey, there's a similarity here with something to do with Platonism. I don't really know what it is, but he doesn't go bananas about it, like a lot of people do.
I think that we're circling around something that's really vital about the archetypes, which is that even if you go back to the very beginning where Jung has formulated these different psychological forces that are embodied inside the human psyche, we're forced to wrestle with the fact that there is not a single interpretation of like what is good, what is bad, what is healthy, where you have to start, what is the process you have to follow in order to be able to emerge in some place where you are now closer to the truth, closer to ideal. It's very squishy. And maybe what we're pointing to is that when you are at the spear tip of progress and you are living in a society that is fundamentally different from the society that even your parents lived in, there is not a unified and final expression that you can say, this is the way that you should interpret the world and act accordingly. It is more like we are living through a time where we're struggling to figure out what that even looks like. And that's why it's so hard to formulate and to put into cohesive, actionable principles, because we're like, look, go into the unconscious and create something and see where it takes you. That to me seems like a prescription for not a cure, but a path. And it seems like what we are on as a culture is at this place where there is not a clear path forward. It is not like we are living 10,000 years ago and we're like, well, everybody's always done it this way, and so we should just keep doing it this way. We're literally at a point where we are just in the middle of a storm that is transforming everything. It is this deep evolutionary moment where we have to make choices about what to believe and where to go. And you can believe that the world is made out of mathematics, and that'll take you down one path, and 10,000 years from now, you might be the grayling aliens that are, time traveling to do experiments on humans on Earth in the modern day. Or you may take that, no, there's a foundational base reality, and you end up as some, deeply agrarian civilization that has a completely different physiology and a completely different way of being. But that path diverges right now in this moment as we are trying to wrestle with what our instincts are telling us. And those instincts do not tell people the same thing. There is no sense of a unified human 10,000 years from now, I don't think.
That's a very interesting point. Part of that, I think, comes from the fact that we're all at different stages of our own journey. We're not all just starting off now with some kind of collective project. And yet, unfortunately, we have that Darwinian biology, and it will want us to manifest those baser instinctive potentials first. We can't really get away from that. But there is a promise, I suppose, and it's one of Jung's central messages, that the unconscious can be felt almost as if sometimes like a will of God. He used that exact phrase. Your destiny and who you are supposed to be, which is individual to you, but the template is shared across the entirety of the human species, is something we need to listen to, like a vocation. And further towards the end of his life, he writes an essay. It's one of my favorites of his, because he reads like he's absolutely pissed off with everybody and the world. And he says that the modern neurotic man or woman isn't suffering from this or that, or don't put labels on things. They're suffering from a lack of amour fati, love of fate. And if somebody misses or refuses to listen to that calling of who they're supposed to be, well, you've missed your chance, and never will you be able to say with the great men of history, for good or for bad or otherwise, that I've done that and I've fulfilled that. I'm not saying that's an ethic that everyone should live by, but it's Jung being crystal clear as to what the basis of what he was saying was. If we don't listen to the unconscious, we will live an unlived life. All the opportunities and things that we should have done will pass us by. The collective, this goes right back to the beginning of our talk, the collective problems, I don't know how we're going to solve those. Jung didn't have any solutions to those either. He had predictions about the future that turned out to be wrong, unfortunately. He puts them down in the book Ion. It wasn't perfect. His thing was, we must all take on that responsibility ourselves as individuals, not in the stoic, rugged, individualistic sense, but just listen to what's trying to come through us. And for a lot of people, that's going to sound woolly. And unfortunately, in a realistic world, for a lot of people, that's not going to chip through. The instincts are too powerful. They want what's theirs. They're already caught up in collective myths, political or otherwise. But what else can we do? I don't know. Maybe it's going to be a shared journey between lots of different disciplines, all pointing the same way. Maybe there'll be an enantiodromia, a Jungian word from Heraclitus, meaning a sudden flip into its opposite as we get closer and closer towards utter madness. I don't know. What I do know is that Jung stuff really does work individually with individual people to make them happier and calmer and more themselves. And that's something worth pursuing, at the very least.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, man. This has been a really productive conversation for me personally. I hope we get to talk again, James. This has really flown by. I appreciate you spending the morning with us, and I guess evening for you across the pond.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. The time has flown by. So yeah, thank you guys for inviting me on. Hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot left on the table. We'll do some more reading of Jung, and so hopefully we can have a shared starting point a little bit deeper.
And everybody should check out your channel. Do you? I guess we'll just link it down below. You go really deep on this, and then I know you have sort of closed door version of that goes even deeper into the various aspects of the Jungian platform.
Yeah, do you want to plug both of those right now?
Yeah, so my channel at James P. Dowling, so just my name. Yeah, if people are interested in Jung, they're probably going to enjoy the stuff that I'm putting out. If they're really interested in Jung and really want to study Jung, yeah, I run a private podcast every Friday. A new audio-only episode drops where we literally go through Jung line by line. Every footnote, we expand on every single point. That's not for everybody. That's for people who are a bit mad, like me. So the offer's there. No one jump into that without looking at the content first. So lots more stuff to come. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to pin your guys' channel as well on mine, or a certain section, because I think what you're doing is very important. And I think this is an intuition. The lineage point we keep hitting at is something that we should explore at some point in some capacity. I think there's a lot in there.
I agree. It was really wonderful to meet you. It's always good to find somebody who's pushing at a renaissance as opposed to revolution. I think that that's the most beautiful way that I can see the future unfolding. So thank you for that.
Likewise, guys. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you again.
Have a good rest of your night, James.
Take care.
Bye everybody.